No use fighting, miss. You're coming with us.
Then pray Jesse finds me before I lose my patience.
Why help me after what was done to you?
Because I treat wounds. Even on men serving the wrong
Maeve, come with me. Right now.
Decker, step aside. This ends here.
In the Red Canyon country of 878 Arizona, a drifting cavalry scout finally stops running, all because of a woman laughing alone in the mud. Read and discover what happens when a man who spent 9 years leaving finally finds something worth staying for. The canyon swallowed sound and spat it back wrong. Jesse Kincaid had learned that lesson the hard way, somewhere in the Tennessee hills in '63, when a laugh from the tree line turned out to be a Reb sharpshooter with a mouthful of tobacco and a bead on his sergeant's neck. After that, Jesse stopped assuming. He started listening instead, really listening the way you do when the price of getting it wrong is your life. So when the laughter came rolling off the red sandstone walls of Sunstone Canyon that July afternoon, high and clear and bouncing every which direction, Jesse pulled his buckskin mare to a dead stop and had his colt drawn before the echo finished. He sat perfectly still. The mare's ears swiveled. Her breathing stayed calm. That was something, at least. Animals didn't lie the way people did. He scanned the canyon rim above him, nothing. Scanned the dry brush along the creek bank, nothing moving but a roadrunner that had better sense than to hang around. The laughter came again, and this time he caught something underneath it. Not menace. Not the brittle, forced quality of a man trying to draw somebody out. This was genuine. Surprised, even. The kind of sound a person makes when they've tripped over their own feet in private and found it funny rather than humiliating. Jesse kept the colt up anyway. He nudged the mare forward, slow and careful, picking along the narrow game trail that followed the creek's south bank. The creek itself was running lower than it should have been for July. He'd noticed that 20 minutes back and filed it away. Arizona Territory had its dry spells, sure, but Sunstone Creek had a reputation as a reliable water source, fed by snowmelt from the mountains north of Oakhaven. Seeing it, this thin and sluggish, sat wrong with him, like a clock that's lost a few seconds per day. Not broken yet, but headed somewhere bad. He rounded a bend where two canyon walls pinched close together, and a pair of cottonwood trees had managed to take root in a crack of rock, and that's when he saw her, waist-deep in a wide, flat section of the creek where the current had fattened into still water, and underneath that still water, apparently, a bed of mud with opinions about letting go. Because the woman was not swimming, and she was not wading, she was stuck. Thoroughly, impressively, almost magnificently stuck. Her lower half had disappeared into the gray-brown muck like she'd been planted there, and every time she tried to pull one leg free, the other one sank a little deeper, and the whole effort produced a slow, wet, sucking sound that was nearly comical in how serious it was. She had dark red hair that the creek had done its best to ruin, plastered to her neck and one cheek. Her blouse, white, or it had been this morning, was soaked through and streaked with mud to the collar. Her herb basket, a wide flat thing woven from river cane, was floating 6 feet away from her, listing to one side, bundles of dried plants beginning to separate and drift downstream, like a small, cheerful funeral. She watched it go, then she laughed again. Not a nervous laugh, not a defeated one, just a clear, honest acknowledgement that the situation had gotten completely away from her. And that was, when you really looked at it squarely, a little bit funny. Jesse holstered the colt. He sat on the mare for a moment, watching. His first instinct, and he'd spent 15 years of his life obeying his first instincts. Since they'd kept him breathing, when better men hadn't, was to assess before acting. She wasn't drowning. The water was maybe 3 feet deep at the deepest point, and she had both arms free and her head well clear of the surface. The mud was the problem, not the creek. She was in no danger of going under, but she was going nowhere either. And the sun in this canyon was brutal, and that basket was getting farther away by the second. She must have heard the mare, because she turned then. looked straight at him through a curtain of wet hair. She blinked once, wiped a smear of mud from her eyelashes, with 2 fingers, a gesture so practical and unself-conscious that something in Jesse's chest did a strange, quiet thing he chose not to examine, and fixed him with a look that was more amused than embarrassed. "Are you going to help?" she said, or stare. No distress in it. No pleading. Just a direct, reasonable question from a woman who had clearly sized up the situation, identified the available resources, and was inquiring as to their intentions. Jesse almost smiled. He caught it before it got all the way there. He swung down from the mare and looped her reins around a cottonwood branch, then went to his saddlebag and pulled out a length of braided rope, the same one he used for working green horses. 30 feet, good hemp, worn soft, with use. He tied one end around the saddle horn in a quick half-hitch that would hold without binding. "Don't pull," he said, walking to the bank's edge. "You pull, you go deeper. Mud works like quicksand when you fight it." She looked at him with an expression that said she had already figured this out, and he was welcome for the confirmation. "I'm aware. I've been trying to walk sideways." She demonstrated a slow, shuffling step to the left that moved her maybe 3 inches and produced that remarkable sucking sound again. "It's slow. It's working, though. It's working like January," she said. Jesse crouched at the bank's edge, measuring the distance. The mud started about 4 feet out from solid ground, where the bank softened into silt. He could see the line of it, the color change in the water, the slight sheen on the surface. "I'm going to come in," he said. "I'll stay on the edge of the mud bed and throw you the rope. Loop it under your arms, not around your waist. Around your waist, and the pull knock the breath out of you." She nodded, like this was a sensible briefing, and she was paying attention. He pulled, his boots off. Good boots were hard to replace on a scout's pay, and that reasoning hadn't died just because the war had, and rolled his canvas trousers to the knee. The bank mud was cold compared to the afternoon air, and it grabbed at his feet immediately. That particular suction you had to respect. He stayed at the edge. Threw the rope, underhand, easy, right to her. She caught it without fumbling, which he noted, looped it under her arms the way he'd said, crossed it in front of her chest, and got a grip on the doubled length above the crosspoint. She knew something about ropes, or she was a quick study. Either way, it was good. "Ready?" she said. Jesse worked his way back to solid ground, following his own footprints exactly, so he didn't press fresh mud. He untied the rope from the saddle horn. He'd pull her himself, not spook the mare with the strain, and braced his feet wide on the bank. "Walk sideways," he said. "Same direction you were going. Don't fight upward, just sideways. Let me do the lifting. You've done this before. Pulled a horse out of a bog in Tennessee," he said. "You're lighter." She laughed again at bright and short, and he felt it like a plucked string. He pulled steady, not a heave, not a jerk steady, even pressure, the same way he'd coax a green horse past something that scared it. You couldn't force your way through. You had to make the effort consistent until the thing you were working against simply ran out of resistance. The mud released her left leg first, with a sound like a cork coming out of a bottle, and then she was walking, and he was pulling, and it wasn't graceful. She stumbled once when her right foot came free faster than she expected, and she lurched sideways and nearly went face first into the shallows. But she caught herself with a sharp, athletic pivot that suggested she wasn't a stranger to bad footing. And then she was on the bank. He reached out on instinct and caught her arm when she swayed, and the pull of the rope brought her forward, and she came up against his chest with a solid, breathless impact, and neither of them moved for a moment. She smelled like crushed herbs and creek water, and something else underneath chamomile maybe, or the particular green smell of cut stems. He was aware of this in a vivid, specific way that surprised him, because Jesse Kincaid did not generally pay close attention to how people smelled. He paid attention to sight lines and exit routes and the weight of a room. He was also aware, with equal vividness, of trail dust and leather and horse, sweat his own smell, The practical smell of a man who'd been riding since before dawn, and of how completely different it was from hers, and of how those two things existed right now, in the same 6 inches of air between them. She looked up at him. Her eyes were brown, not the usual flat brown, but something warmer, the color of creek water over sandstone. She still had mud on her jaw. She was the least discomposed person he had ever held against his chest. He let go of her arm and stepped back, and she let the rope go slack and stepped back too. And they stood on the bank with the creek moving past, and the cottonwood leaves making their dry, papery sound in the hot wind. "Thank you," she said. Not theatrical about it, just honest. "Sure," he said. She looked downstream at her basket, which had drifted another 10 feet and was now caught against a rock, spinning slowly. She sighed. Then she walked downstream along the bank, calm as anything, and waded in at a shallower point ankle-deep, solid footing, and retrieved it. The herbs were mostly intact, weighted down by damp. She sorted through them with efficient hands, shaking water from each bundle, laying them over the basket's edge to start drying. Jesse coiled his rope and watched her. He hadn't intended to watch her. His intention, formed somewhere back in that moment before he'd heard the laughter, had been to reach Oakhaven by sundown, find the livery, ask about the horse-breaking work that a man named Callum Walsh had written him about, sleep in a bed for the first time in 11 days, and keep his head down. Those were good intentions. Sensible ones. He was still holding the coiled rope. "What's in Oakhaven?" she asked, without looking up from the herbs. She'd guessed from something the mare's loaded saddlebags, maybe, or the general look of a man going somewhere. "Work," he said. "Horse ranch. Man named?" "Walsh. Callum Walsh." She nodded. "He's a fair man, hard work but fair. You break horses?" "I gentle them." She looked up at that, considered him for a moment with those sandstone eyes. "There's a difference. Most people don't think so. Most people are wrong most of the time," she said pleasantly, and went back to her herbs. Jesse pulled his boots back on. He had mud to his knees and no particular remedy for it. He'd dried out before. "You're headed to Oakhaven too," he said. It wasn't really a question. The direction she'd come from was deeper canyon, and there was nothing that way except the creek and the red rock walls. "I am. I work at the clinic, Dr. Pierce's." She stood and settled the basket over her arm. It was heavy, he could see that, from the way she adjusted her stance, but she didn't ask for help with it, and he didn't offer yet. "I was harvesting feverfew and willow bark. There's a stretch of it, half a mile upstream." She paused. "Or there was. The creek's lower than it should be. The stand's half out of the water now. Creek's running thin," he agreed. Noticed it coming in. Something shifted in her expression. Not alarm, exactly, more like confirmation of something she'd been tracking with increasing worry. "It's been dropping for 2 weeks. Dr. Pierce thinks something's changed upstream." She looked at the sluggish water. "People in the lower camps are already feeling it." Jesse thought about that. He thought about it the way he thought about most things, briefly, practically, without letting it pull him in too far. It wasn't his problem. He was passing through. He'd spent enough years riding toward other people's problems, and coming away from them changed in ways he hadn't asked for. "I'll walk with you," he said, "to Oakhaven." It came out before he'd decided to say it. He stood there with his boots on and his rope coiled and considered what had just happened in his own mouth. She looked at him with something that might have been amusement again. "Your horse would walk faster. The mare's been going since sunup." She could use an easy pace. This was true. It was also not the whole truth, and he suspected she knew that, but she didn't press it. She just turned and started walking the trail toward Oakhaven, and he led the mare and walked alongside. The canyon was beautiful, the way dangerous things often are. The sandstone glowed a deep orange red in the afternoon light, streaked with purple shadow, where the walls grew taller. The creek ran quiet beside them. Overhead, a pair of red-tailed hawks turned slow circles on the thermals, patient as judges. "Jesse Kincaid," he said, after they'd walked 100 yards in silence. He'd realized somewhere in that 100 yards, that he hadn't introduced himself, and that this was rude, and that he didn't want to be rude to her particularly. Maeve Holloway, she said. The herbs, he said. Are they for specific patients? Willow bark. Tea for fever, we've got 3 miners running temperatures from a water source that's gone bad. Feverfew for the headaches that come with it. She touched the basket's edge, checking the arrangement of the drying bundles. The creek water's been fine closer to the source, but the pools in the lower camps are stagnating. When water stops moving, it turns. Jesse was quiet for a moment. He'd seen that too. Army camps where the water detail got lazy, where they drew from standing pools instead of moving water. He'd seen what followed. Do you know what's stopping it? He asked. Not yet. Her voice was level, but there was something compressed underneath it. The way a person sounds when they're managing their worry carefully so it doesn't spill out and slow them down. Dr. Pierce sent a letter to the county recorder last week. Haven't heard back. Jesse didn't say anything to that. He'd met enough county recorders in enough territories to know that letters sent by frontier doctors about water rights moved at the speed of indifference when there was money in the question. And there was usually money in the question. They came around a bend, and Oak Haven appeared below them, settled in a wide valley between the canyon's southern exit and a long, flat mesa that turned gold in this light. It was a real town, bigger than he'd expected from Walsh's letter, a proper main street with plank boardwalks, a church steeple, what looked like a 2-story hotel, and a scattering of houses and outbuildings spreading outward into the flats. On the near edge of town, he could see a low adobe building with a red-painted door that had the purposeful, worn-in look of a place that got used hard and kept going anyway. That's the clinic, Maeve said, nodding toward it. Good placement. He meant it, close to the canyon trail, which is how most of the injured would come in. She glanced at him, sidelong. You notice things. Habit. Military. Cavalry scout, he said. Finished out the war at 20. Kept moving after. She didn't push on that. Most people pushed on it. They wanted the shape of the story, where he'd been, what he'd seen, whether he'd killed anyone, said in a way that was really asking about something else. Maeve Holloway just nodded and filed it somewhere and didn't reach for more than he'd given. He respected that more than he could have explained. The trail descended into the valley, and the heat rose off the hard-packed earth in visible waves. The mare stepped carefully over a stretch of loose shale, and Jesse steadied her with one hand on the lead rope and his body tilted slightly toward her, instinctive. Maeve, watch this. You're good with her. She's a good mare. Honest animal. Honest. Doesn't pretend she's not scared when she is. Doesn't pretend she's tired when she isn't. You always know where you are with her. Maeve was quiet for a moment. Then that's a good thing to be. They reached the valley floor, and the trail widened into a proper road, rutted with wagon tracks. 2 men on horseback passed them going the other direction, moving fast, not speaking. Both wore the same heavy canvas dusters, despite the heat, which said they were working for someone who provided a uniform, which said something else again. Jesse tracked them out of old habit until they disappeared up the canyon trail. Sterling's men, Maeve said, noticing. Her voice had gone flat in a particular way. Sterling. Harlan Sterling. He has a mining operation north of the valley, and ambitions that go somewhat beyond mining. She said this with precision and a visible restraint that told him the subject had history behind it. Real history, recent and ongoing. He owns most of the land along the upper creek. Jesse did not say anything. He turned this information over, set it alongside the thin creek and the bad water in the lower camps and the letter to the county recorder that hadn't been answered. And he looked at the shape of it the way you look at terrain before you ride into it. He didn't like the shape, but it wasn't his problem. He was here for Walsh's horses. He'd be here for 2 months, maybe 3. Get and move on to wherever came next. That was the plan. That had been the plan for 9 years, and it had served him well enough, in the way that surviving something counts as serving you well. The clinic's red door was standing open. From inside came the sound of voices low, calm, professional, and underneath that, the particular silence of someone in pain. Maeve walked straight to it without hesitation, the wet herb basket swinging, the mud still in her hair. She stopped at the threshold and turned back to him. He'd stopped without meaning, too, some 10 feet from the door. The mare stood at his shoulder. He had nowhere particular to be for another hour, and Walsh's ranch was another mile east of town, and he was still holding his rope. Callum Walsh's ranch is east along the main road, she said. The painted white gate. You can't miss it. She paused. I didn't catch your first name. Jesse, she nodded. She looked at him for a moment, the direct, measuring look that didn't feel like judgment, more like genuine attention, which was rarer, and then she said, Thank you for the rope, Jesse. Anytime, he said. And then, because that word implied he was intending to stay anywhere long enough for it to mean something, he added, Good luck with the water. She looked at the creek, visible at the edge of town, where it crossed under a wooden bridge. She looked at it the way you look at something you're going to fight, once you've figured out how. Then she looked back at him. Thank you, she said again. And this time it had more weight in it, like it was covering more ground than one afternoon in a mud bed. She went inside. Jesse stood with his mare in the baking late afternoon heat of Oakhaven, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1878, and he stood there about 15 seconds longer than a man passing through would stand anywhere. Then he put on his hat, he'd been holding it since the canyon, and turned east on the main road toward the white-painted gate. He did not look back. He thought about the color of her eyes over sandstone. He thought about the way she'd laughed in the mud before she knew anyone was watching. He thought about her voice going flat when she said Sterling's men, the restraint in it, the history. He kept his eyes on the road. The mare walked steady beside him, honest as always, and the last of the afternoon light lay long and red across the valley floor. And somewhere behind him, in the clinic with the red door, Maeve Holloway was already back at work. Jesse Kincaid told himself, clearly and firmly, that he was here for the horses. He almost believed it. The clinic smelled like pine tar soap, and something sharper underneath carbolic acid, which Dr. Pierce ordered from a supplier in Tucson and used with a religious consistency that the miners found strange, and Maeve had come to understand, was the difference between a wound that healed and one that didn't. She came through the red door, still damp, still muddy from the knee down, and went straight to the wash basin in the front room without being told. That was the first rule Pierce had given her 3 years ago, when she'd shown up at 17 with a dead father, no prospect, and a working knowledge of plant medicine she'd learned from her mother before her mother followed her father into the ground. Wash first every time, no exceptions. She'd asked why back then. He'd explained about Semmelweis, about the Vienna hospital, about invisible particles on the hands that moved from one patient to the next and killed them quietly, while everyone assumed the problem was bad air or God's will. That explanation had changed how she thought about almost everything. Pierce was at the back of the clinic's main room, bent over a cot where a man lay with his forearm elevated and wrapped in a temporary dressing already blooming red at the center. Julian Ruiz stood at the foot of the cot, hat in hand, jaw set with a particular kind of controlled worry that Maeve recognized as his default expression lately. Julian ran the crew at the number 3 shaft, half a mile up the canyon road. He came in with his men often enough that he knew exactly where Pierce kept the clean rags. Saw blade? Maeve asked, reading the angle of the wound through the dressing. Gear housing. Julian looked at her. His eyes went briefly to her mud-caked blouse, and he said nothing about it, because Julian Ruiz understood that there were more important things to discuss at most moments. It was loose. We told Garfield's foreman 2 weeks ago. Is he conscious? In and out. Pierce looked up. He was 61 years old, gray-whiskered, with the careful, economical movements of a man who'd been doing precise work in imprecise conditions for decades. His eyes registered the mud and the missing herbs and adjusted quickly. Willow bark? In the basket. It's wet but intact. She set it on the side table and began unpacking the bundles, laying them flat to dry properly. The feverfew, too. Creaks lower than last week, the stands half exposed. Pierce made a sound in his throat that meant he'd heard her and was filing it somewhere serious. He turned back to his patient and began unwrapping the temporary dressing with steady hands. Maeve was already moving. She pulled her work apron off its hook, tied it over the ruined blouse, and went to the instrument cabinet for the suture kit. She set water to boil on the small iron stove in the corner, checked the carbolic solution, laid out a clean field cloth on the side table nearest Pierce. This was the rhythm of the place. It had taken her 6 months to learn it well enough to anticipate rather than react, and another 6 months before Pierce stopped narrating what he needed and just worked because she was already there with it. She was proud of that. In a quiet way, she didn't talk about. The clinic had 4 cots, a surgery area screened off by a canvas curtain, the instrument cabinet, the stove, and a small dispensary room in the back, where Pierce kept his medicines, and Maeve kept her organized rows of dried plants, tinctures, and the careful notes she took on what worked, what didn't, and what doses produced which results. It was not a large space. On a bad week, it was not nearly large enough. This was shaping up to be a bad week. Beyond Julian's man on the cot, 2 other cots were occupied. Old Petrovich, a Ukrainian powder man who'd been running fever for 4 days and whose English topped out at a cheerful good morning regardless of the hour. And a young woman named Sissy, maybe 16, who did laundry for the camp families and had come in that morning with a burn across her left hand from a lye soap accident, which Maeve had cleaned and bandaged and was monitoring for infection. The clinic was at 3/4 capacity, and the sun hadn't gone down yet. Pierce closed the wound with the neat close sutures he'd learned in an army field hospital, during a war that had convinced him that medicine was the only honest profession, since bodies told you the truth, whether you wanted to hear it or not. Maeve held the lamp steady where he needed it, handed him thread when he asked, and kept her eye on the patient's color, which was pale but stable. They were still at it, Pierce finishing the last suture, and Maeve beginning to dress the wound properly when the door came open. Not knocked, opened. The way people open doors they've decided belonged to them. The man who walked in was broad through the shoulders in a way that was more fed than built, wearing a suit that cost real money, the kind of money that liked to make itself visible. His right hand was wrapped in a handkerchief, and he held it elevated with the studied urgency of a man accustomed to having his discomfort taken seriously. Behind him, just outside the door, 2 more men waited in the heavy canvas dusters Maeve had seen on Sterling's riders. They didn't come inside. They didn't need to. Pierce didn't look up from his sutures. The man in the suit surveyed the room, the way men like him surveyed rooms, taking inventory, assigning value, finding the person in charge so he could address himself to them and ignore everyone else. His eyes settled on Pierce as the obvious candidate. "Doctor, I've had an accident." He held up the handkerchief as evidence. "I can see that," Pierce said, still not looking up. "Sit down. I'll be with you in a few minutes." The man's expression shifted slightly. He wasn't used to in a few minutes. "I'm in considerable pain. So is Mr. Davio," Maeve said from her position at the dressing. Her voice was even, conversational. "His forearm was cut to the bone. He'll keep." The man turned to look at her fully, taking in the apron and the mud and whatever conclusions he drew from them. "I'm Crane," he said. The name dropped like it was supposed to mean something. "Richard Crane. I manage operations for Harlan Sterling." Maeve unwound a length of clean linen and began her first wrap. "Mr. Crane." She acknowledged the name without being impressed by it. Then she held out her free hand toward him, palm up, requesting. He looked at the hand, then at her. "I beg your pardon? Your handkerchief." He unwrapped it slowly, with the reluctance of a man unaccustomed to being directed by anyone in an apron. The wound underneath was a diagonal, cut across the meat of his palm, maybe an inch and a half long. It had bled enthusiastically, the way palm cuts did, but it had already slowed to a seep. No depth to it, no tendon involvement that she could see from where she stood. She looked at it for exactly as long as it took to know what it was. Then she went to the supply shelf, took down a clean cloth, folded it to a compress, and put it in Crane's hand without ceremony. "Press that firmly," she said. She turned back to Davio's arm. Crane stood there, holding the compress. The clinic's ambient sound continued. Petrovich's congested breathing, the fire in the stove, Pierce's quiet movements behind the curtain where he'd gone to wash up. Crane pressed the cloth to his palm and looked around for somewhere to put the affront he was feeling. "I should be seen immediately," he said. "Mr. Sterling expects. Your hand needs salt water." Maeve kept her eyes on the dressing. Her voice didn't change. "If I let go of this miner's severed artery for 2 minutes, he bleeds out. Sit down and wait." The room was quiet for a moment. Julian Ruiz, at the foot of Davio's cot, had gone very still, not because he was afraid, because he was the kind of man who knew the difference between a moment that called for action and one that called for absolute stillness. And this was the second kind. Crane looked at Maeve's back. He looked at the wounded man on the cot. He looked at the door, where his men stood waiting, and whatever calculation he ran in his head, it came out in a direction he didn't love but could live with for now. He crossed to the chair by the wall, the only chair in the room not being used for medical purposes, and sat down in it like he was doing the chair a favor. Maeve finished the dressing. It was good work. She'd gotten better at it over 3 years. Learned the tension that was firm enough to support the wound, but not so tight it restricted blood flow. Pierce had shown her twice, and then watched her do it herself, correcting with his hands rather than words, the way you teach something that lives in the fingers. She tied off the end and checked her work. Then she straightened and spoke to Julian. "I'll write down the instructions for the dressing changes. Every day, clean water and fresh linen. Come back in 3 days and I'll check it." She looked at Davio, who'd surfaced enough to be aware of the room. "You understand?" 3 days, see," Davio said. His voice was thin but clear, Tres Dias. Julian put his hat back on. He looked at Crane, sitting in the chair, and the look was brief and specific, the look of a man recording something for future reference. Then he looked at Maeve. "The water in the South Camp," he said quietly. 3 more people sick this morning." "I know." She kept her voice low, too, though Crane was 10 feet away and could likely hear every word. "Tell them to use the creek water upstream of the bridge only. Boil it first. Don't touch the pool water at all. They know this already. Tell them again." She touched his arm briefly, an acknowledgement rather than a gesture of comfort, because Julian Ruiz didn't need comforting. He needed to know she was paying attention. "I'm working on the rest." Julian nodded. He helped Davio to sitting, then to standing, and guided him toward the door with a hand under his good arm. They passed Crane without looking at him. The door closed behind them. Pierce came back through the curtain. He took in the room's arrangement, Crane in the chair, Maeve at the supply shelf, the completed dressing work with one comprehensive glance, and crossed to wash his hands again at the basin. "Mr. Crane," he said pleasantly, drying his hands. "Let's have a look." Maeve put the kettle on for the salt water while Pierce examined Crane's palm. She listened without turning around, tracking the conversation, the way she tracked anything in the clinic for what it meant medically and for what it meant otherwise. "Clean cut," Pierce said. "You'll want a suture or two to close it properly." "Fine," Crane said. "Do it, it'll scar. These palm cuts always do."
How did broken glass?
"One of the assay office windows," Crane's tone said. This was all the explanation available. "How long will it take to heal?" "A week for the stitches to take. 2 weeks before I'd recommend putting real stress on it." Pierce was already threading a needle. "You work with your hands?" "I work with other people's hands," Crane said. Maeve brought the warm saltwater solution and set it on the table beside Pierce. She began tidying the used supplies from Davio's treatment, working quietly, moving through the room on the routes she'd memorized so she could navigate in the dark if she had to, which she had, twice, during night emergencies, when the lamp oil ran low. She was reaching across Petrovich's cot to check his forehead when Crane spoke again. Not to Pierce, this time, aimed somewhere in her direction. "You run a liberal establishment here, Doctor." The word liberal carried a freight of meaning. He was delivering carefully, like something he wanted to throw hard, but was restraining himself to a lob. Migrant labor taking precedence over a minor laceration? Pierce said pleasantly. He took his first stitch. "Standard practice, Mr. Crane. We treat by severity. It's what medicine is." And Crane stopped, reconsidered his wording. "Your assistant speaks to clients in a way that might benefit from refinement." Pierce glanced up. His eyes found Maeve across the room and returned to his work. "She speaks accurately," he said. "Medicine benefits from accuracy." Maeve checked Petrovich's temperature the way Pierce had taught her, back of the hand to the forehead to the cheek, noting any difference in heat between sides of the face, which could indicate localized infection. Petrovich opened his eyes, focused on her, and said good morning in a voice like wet gravel. "Good evening," she said. "You're a little cooler. That's good." "Good morning," he said again, with calm satisfaction, and closed his eyes. She picked up his water cup, saw it was half empty, and refilled it from the clean pitcher, upstream water, boiled that morning, filtered through clean cloth. She left it where he could reach it when he woke. The water situation was in her head, the same way it had been in her head for 2 weeks, running underneath everything else she did, the way a creek ran underneath ice present, moving, not visible, but making itself felt. 3 more people sick this morning. Julian's voice had been steady saying it. That steadiness cost him something, and she knew it, upstream. The word kept snagging on something. Whatever was damming the creek flow was doing it upstream, and the result was stagnating water in the lower pools. And stagnating water in heat like this became something that could kill a person as efficiently as a bullet, just slower and quieter, and without leaving evidence that pointed anywhere useful. She needed to know what was upstream. Pierce finished Crane's sutures in the efficient silence of a man who'd been doing this long enough that conversation was optional. He bandaged the hand with the same care he gave everyone, not more, not less. That was a thing Maeve had watched and absorbed and understood as a kind of ethics made physical. The body in front of you was what mattered, not the body's address or bank account. Crane flexed his bandaged hand carefully, testing. "What do I owe you?" Pierce named a fair price. Crane paid it without comment, which meant it was less than he'd expected, which meant he'd expected to be gouged and couldn't find the angle when he wasn't. He stood and smoothed his suit jacket. He looked at Maeve one more time. She was at the dispensary room door, checking her notes from the morning against the current inventory, doing it with the pencil tucked behind her ear that she always forgot was there until she reached for it and found it already in hand. "Mr. Sterling will be interested to know what sort of operation you're running here," Crane said. To Pierce, nominally. But the words spread out to fill the room the way smoke does. Pierce looked at him with mild, attentive eyes. "Tell him we're running a medical clinic. We treat whoever needs it. That's a fairly conventional operation in most parts." Crane went to the door, paused. "Sterling's making improvements to this valley, the kind of improvements that benefit everyone who's positioned to benefit from them." He opened the door. The evening air came in, warm and dry, carrying a thin smell of dust. "Thought you should know that." The door closed behind him. Pierce stood for a moment in the quiet. Then he went to wash his hands again. There was a frequency to that habit that never varied, because the worst thing Pierce believed in was complacency, and Maeve heard the water running and let herself exhale slowly. "Position to benefit," she said. "Yes." Pierce dried his hands. "I noticed that qualifier, too. He came in here to look at us." She turned away from the dispensary. The cut on his hand, that's not why he came. Pierce considered this. He sat down on the stool beside the instrument cabinet, which was what he did when he wanted to think carefully. You may be right, he said. Though the cut is real enough. The cut is real. The reason for being in this part of town on a Wednesday evening isn't. She leaned against the doorframe. He wanted to see who was treating the miners. How many? Who was paying attention? Sterling's paying attention to the miners, Pierce said. That's been clear for a while. Because of the water. Pierce looked at her. His face, which generally committed to professional neutrality the way a good fence committed to straight lines, showed a brief flicker of something more complicated. Concern, maybe. Calculation. Because of the water, he agreed. And what's above it? The land. The route north. He paused. I've written to the county recorder. Julian says 3 more sick today. I know, he rubbed his eyes with 2 fingers. The willow bark tea will help the fever. It won't help what's causing it. He looked at her steadily. I need to find out what's happening to that creek. The evening deepened outside the small, high-set windows. The heat was releasing slowly, the way it did in this country reluctantly, without enthusiasm, giving back only what it absolutely had to. Maeve went around the room and lit the 2 oil lamps, and the clinic settled into its nighttime version of itself, the shadows pushed back to the corners, the cots with their patients becoming the whole world for the length of the room. She was putting the dried herb bundles in the dispensary when she heard boots on the boards outside. She registered the rhythm of them, not urgent, not the staccato of someone carrying something or someone, and relaxed. The knock that followed was polite. That was also information. Pierce called, "Come in." Jesse Kincaid opened the door. He'd cleaned up some. The mud was off his boots and his face, and he'd changed his shirt, which was now a dark flannel that had been washed enough to go soft at the elbows. He still had the look he'd had in the canyon, that particular alert stillness of a man who'd been in enough unexpected situations to develop the habit of reading a room before he walked into it all the way. His eyes moved across the clinic's contents in a brief arc, landed on Pierce, on the occupied cots, on Maeve in the dispensary doorway. He nodded to Pierce. "Dr. Pierce," he said. "My name's Jesse Kincaid. I'm working for Callum Walsh. I rode with Miss Holloway this afternoon." He stopped and reconsidered the phrasing, walked in with her from the canyon. She left her salve tin at the creek bank. He held it up. A small, flat tin with a fitted lid, the kind Maeve used for the beeswax and yarrow, preparation she made for cracked hands and minor cuts. She'd had it in her basket when she went in after the herbs. She must have set it on a rock at the bank and walked off without it. She crossed the room and took it from him. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't notice you had other things going on." He said it without irony. "This is Jesse Kincaid," Maeve said to Pierce. "He pulled me out of the sunstone mud this afternoon. Rope and patience." Pierce extended his hand, and Jesse shook it, and Pierce did what he always did when shaking hands took in the hands themselves, quickly and without making a performance of it. Professional habit. Jesse's hands were calloused in specific places, not from a single type of work, but from several layered callouses that came from rope and reins and probably rifle stock over a long time. "You're breaking horses for Walsh?" Pierce said. "Starting tomorrow." Jesse looked at the cots. Not nosily. More like he was checking something he'd been thinking about. "Busy night?" "Moderate," Pierce said. "We've seen busier." "The water situation," Jesse said. "Not a question." He was looking at Petrovich, at the particular color of the man's face, which Maeve had learned to read the way a person learned to read any language they were surrounded by long enough. "Among other things," Pierce said carefully. Jesse was quiet for a moment. He turned the brim of his hat, in his hands, 2 rotations, the unconscious movement of a man thinking, without having decided yet whether the thinking was going to turn into speaking. "I noticed the creek coming in," he said finally. "I've seen water behave like that before. Usually means something's changed above it. Flow's been redirected or slowed." Pierce and Maeve looked at each other. "Slowed," Pierce repeated. or stop partway. Water thins out like that when you're drawing from the tail end of what's coming through, like the creek's running on what's left after something else takes the front end. He said it practically. He wasn't trying to make a point. He was just describing what he'd seen. The way a man describes terrain he's ridden through factually without editorial. But the room heard the editorial anyway, because it was in the facts. Maeve thought about Crane, about improvements to this valley, about the meaning of words chosen carefully by men who had lawyers and time. "Where are you boarding?" Pierce asked Jesse. "Walsh's bunkhouse. If you ride the upper creek on any of your days off," Pierce said evenly, "and happen to see anything of note, I wouldn't mind knowing what you found." Jesse looked at him, then at Maeve. Something moved behind his eyes, that internal calculation she'd seen in the canyon. The one where he was measuring something against his habits and finding the measurement uncomfortable. "I'm here for the horses," he said. "Of course," Pierce said pleasantly. He didn't push. That was one of his methods: state a thing, leave room around it, and let a person come to their own conclusions in their own time. He'd explained this to Maeve once. You can't make someone understand something they're not ready to understand, but you can make sure the understanding is available when they get there. Jesse put his hat on. He nodded to Pierce, and then to Maeve, and the nod to Maeve lasted a half-second longer than the nod to Pierce, which she noted and decided not to examine. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Kincaid," she said. "Thank you for the tin." He went out. The door closed quiet behind him, the way it does when a careful person pulls it. Pierce poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and handed one to Maeve, and they stood for a moment in the lamplight, the clinic settling around them, and outside on Oakhaven's Main Street, the ordinary sounds of an evening went on: a wagon, a dog, voices from the direction of the saloon, the dry wind moving down from the canyon. "He sees things," Maeve said. "He does," Pierce agreed. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The coffee was strong and bitter, and exactly right. He'll go looking, whatever he tells himself now. Pierce smiled into his cup. "I expect he will." She thought about Jesse Kincaid, standing at the edge of the clinic with the salve tin in his hand, riding 30 minutes back to return it. That simple, and that unnecessary, and that specific. She thought about his voice in the canyon, steady, even pressure. She thought about the look on his face when he'd mapped the clinic's location and said good placement and meant it. She thought about the creek, running thin. About Julian's quiet voice saying 3 more this morning. She had work to do. She always had work to do. That was not a complaint. It was the shape of a life that she'd chosen as clearly as a person could choose anything, and she was grateful for the shape of it, even on the days it pressed down hard. She finished her coffee and went back to check on Petrovich. "Good morning," he said without opening his eyes. "Good evening," she said, and felt his forehead again, and found it cooler than an hour ago, and was glad. The Walsh Ranch sat on 40 acres of decent grazing land east of Oakhaven, where the canyon's shadow didn't quite reach in the mornings, and the ground was flat enough to work horses without fighting the terrain at the same time. Callum Walsh had built the place up over 12 years from a single corral and a lean-to into something with 2 barns, a proper bunkhouse, a ranch house with a covered porch, and a reputation in 3 counties for producing horses that didn't quit on you. He was also, Jesse discovered on his first morning, a man of few words who communicated primarily through the quality of his silences. An approving silence sounded different from a skeptical one. Jesse was fluent enough in that language by the end of day 1. The horse in question was a blue roan stallion, 4 years old, never broken. Walsh had acquired him from a Navajo trader 6 weeks prior and had left him alone in the far corral since, letting him settle, not rushing it. 2 hands had tried working him in that time. One had a bruised shoulder to show for it. The other had decided ranching wasn't for him after all, and moved on to work in a telegraph office in Tucson. Walsh introduced Jesse to the roan on his second morning with the kind of understatement that was its own form of warning. "He's got opinions," Walsh said. Jesse stood at the fence and looked at the horse for a long time. The roan moved along the far side of the corral with his head high. Tracking Jesse, without looking directly at him, a sideways awareness, all rolling eye and twitching ear. Big animal, 15 hands at least, built through the chest, with the particular combination of intelligence and anxiety that made for either the best horse you'd ever ridden or a serious injury, depending entirely on how the next few weeks went. "What do you know about him?" Jesse asked. "Runs well, smart, doesn't trust fast movements." Walsh leaned on the fence post. "The trader said he was left on his own, too long as a foal. Dam died young. Grew up in the herd, but not quite of it, if you follow." Jesse followed. He'd seen it before. Animals that missed the early socialization developed a particular defensiveness that looked like aggression, but was really just fear that had run out of other options. "I'll need a week before I ask anything of him," Jesse said. "Just presence first. No ropes, no round pen work, just being nearby." Walsh's silence was the approving kind. "You've got the time," he said, and walked back to the barn. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, Jesse was spending 2 hours a morning at the roan's corral fence, doing nothing in particular, reading, once, a 3-month-old newspaper he'd found in the bunkhouse, eating his lunch there on Friday, sitting on the top rail, with his back partly to the horse, which was a deliberate choice direct eye contact read as threat to an anxious animal, and giving your back to something you weren't afraid of was its own kind of message. The roan moved closer by increments. 3 feet Thursday, 18 inches Friday. By Saturday morning, he was standing 6 feet from Jesse's position at the fence, not looking at him, both of them engaged in their separate activities, which was exactly the point. Walsh's ranch hand, a quiet young man named Eli, watched this from a distance with the particular expression of someone who had expected a different kind of horsebreaking and was revising his expectations. "He's not doing anything," Eli said to Walsh, puzzled but not critical. "He's doing plenty," Walsh said. Jesse was aware of being watched and didn't mind it. He'd spent enough time as a cavalry scout being simultaneously visible and ignored, moving through landscapes where being seen was unavoidable, and what mattered was being seen as unthreatening, that the observation didn't change what he was doing or why. Saturday afternoon, Maeve came. He heard the horse before he heard her. The roan shifted, ears swiveling hard to the left, toward the ranch road. Jesse turned and saw her coming up the path from the gate, a canvas satchel over one shoulder and a flat basket in the crook of her arm, different from the herb basket he'd seen in the canyon. She moved at a practical pace, not hurrying, picking her path along the ruts, without looking down at her feet, because she was already looking at the corrals, taking inventory of the space. She'd traded the ruined blouse for a plain blue one, dark enough to hide whatever the day put on it. Her hair was pinned back, but losing the argument in the afternoon wind. She had the focused look of someone in the middle of a task who is also aware of the surrounding world, both things at once, not split between them but running parallel. Walsh met her at the yard's edge. Jesse watched the greeting from the corral fence. Brief and familiar, they knew each other. Maeve handed Walsh the flat basket, said something. Walsh nodded and pointed toward the barn. She said something else, and Walsh gestured toward the far corral, toward Jesse. She came his way. The roan tracked her approach, moved back a few feet, then stilled, head up. Maeve slowed as she got close, reading the horse's posture, and stopped about 15 feet from the fence. She looked at the roan first, then at Jesse. Walsh said, "You had a cut on one of the stock horses," she said. "Back left fetlock. Bay gelding in the near barn," Jesse said. "Caught it on a nail 3 days ago. I've been keeping it clean, but it needs something better than water." She patted the satchel. "I've got a drawing salve that works well on puncture wounds, pulls the bad matter out." She looked at the roan again. "This one's something." "He is." She studied the horse for a moment with genuine attention. The roan regarded her back, tense but not explosive. His weight was still evenly distributed, which meant he was uncertain rather than decided. 6 weeks before me. He's had time to settle. He's just not sure what to do with people yet. Is he aggressive? Defensive? There's a difference. She looked at Jesse, then with an expression he was getting familiar with that thoughtful consideration, direct and without pretense. That said, she was actually listening, rather than just waiting for him to finish. How do you know which you're dealing with? Aggressive. The ears go flat, and they mean it. They come at you with their whole body committed. He watched the roan shift. Defensive. They hold. They look for the exit. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to get to the other side of being scared. Maeve was quiet for a moment. Same as people, then. Jesse considered this and found he had nothing to add to it. She set her satchel down by the fence post. Can I come closer? He glanced at the roan. Slow. Don't face him straight on. Come to the fence at an angle. She moved the way he'd said, unhurried, angled, not looking directly at the horse. She came to stand at the fence beside Jesse, maybe 2 feet of rail between them, and they both stood looking into the corral in the same posture, which was not a coincidence. The roan watched her. He took 1 step back. Then, when nothing alarming happened, he stopped. He's deciding, Jesse said quietly. About me? About whether you're worth worrying about. She considered this with apparent equanimity. What's the verdict? The roan snorted once, shook his head, and walked to the water trough on the far side of the corral in a way that suggested she was not, currently, his primary concern. You passed, Jesse said. She laughed, low and genuine. The roan's ears swiveled at the sound, but he didn't startle, which was good. Should I be flattered? From him? Probably. She stayed at the fence for a minute, watching the roan drink. Jesse was aware of her presence at the edge of his vision, not intrusively aware, not the kind of awareness that made him want to say something to cover it over, just present, the way a campfire is present even when you're not looking at it directly. Walsh said, You used to do this for the cavalry, she said. After the war, there wasn't much call for scouting. Drifted into horsework. He paused. The Army's way of breaking horses is fast and brutal. Gets results, but leaves something damaged in the animal. I couldn't do it that way. She turned her head to look at him. So you found another way. Took some time. He moved along the fence, slow, and the roan tracked him, but held his position. Spent 6 months with a Comanche man in Texas who worked horses differently. Understood that what the horse needed wasn't domination. It needed to understand that the human wasn't a threat, that working together meant something good was coming. 6 months is a long time to spend learning one thing. The best things take time. He said it without weight, just as a fact. And I had nowhere particular to be. She was quiet after that, and the quiet was comfortable in a way Jesse didn't entirely know how to account for. He'd spent a lot of years in uncomfortable silences, the kind that pressed on you, that expected you to fill them with something, and he'd developed the habit of keeping his own counsel so thoroughly that most conversations felt like work. This one didn't. After a while, she picked up her satchel. I should see to the gelding. Near barn. Second stall on the left. She walked toward the barn, and Jesse stayed at the roan's fence, and the afternoon light moved the shadows around, and the horse eventually drifted back toward Jesse's end of the corral, out of what appeared to be mild curiosity, which was the beginning of everything. Walsh's hands finished their work around sundown, and the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a place that has been busy all day and earned its rest. Eli built a fire in the ring near the bunkhouse and put a pot of coffee on, and Walsh came out and leaned on the fence post in the way he did when he was done with the day and not ready to be inside yet. Maeve came back from the barn around the same time, returning the clean tools she'd used to treat the gelding, and Walsh offered her coffee with a gesture, and she sat on the fence rail with her cup, and that was how they all ended up around the fire. As the stars came out, Walsh, Eli, Maeve, and Jesse. No particular reason, just the way an evening arranges itself. Eli asked Maeve about the clinic, and she talked about it easily, the practical details, what cases were common, what she'd learned about local plants. that Pierce hadn't been able to teach her because he didn't know them either. That part she'd worked out herself, studying her mother's old notes and running careful trials. Small amounts first. Observing. Keeping records. Your mother was an herbalist? Eli asked. She knew plants. She didn't call herself anything official. Maeve turned the cup in her hands. The firelight shifted across her face. She grew up in County Clare. Her grandmother taught her, and she taught me. She used to say that plants were the first pharmacy, and anyone who forgot that was going to end up paying a doctor for something they could have grown in a window box. Walsh made a sound that was possibly appreciation. When did you lose her? Eli asked. He was young enough that the question came out direct rather than careful, and his expression afterward suggested he'd realized it might have been too direct. But Maeve didn't retreat from it. I was 12, she said. My father the following spring. She said it plainly. Fever, both of them, which is one of the reasons I ended up working at a clinic. The firepot, horse in the far corral, moved somewhere in the dark. A soft sound of hooves on dry earth. I'm sorry, Eli said. Thank you. She looked at the fire. I was angry about it for a long time. Then I was sad. Then I decided, and I remember the exact morning, I decided I was 15, and it was raining, and I was alone in a rented room. I decided that being angry and sad was using up all the space that could be used for something else. She paused. It doesn't mean the anger and the sadness weren't real. They were. It just means I chose what to do with the room after they moved out. Jesse had been looking at the fire. He looked at her now. She caught his look and held it for a moment, and he saw in her face what he'd heard in her voice. In the canyon, that this was not a performance of strength, not something she'd rehearsed. It was just the position she'd arrived at after real travel and chose to maintain every day because the alternative was to stop moving entirely. The laughter, he said. She tilted her head. In the canyon, before I found you. He turned his cup in his hands. I thought it was a trap. She considered this. It wasn't. I know that now. I was laughing because she looked at the fire and half smiled. Because I'd gone into the same mud bed 3 seasons in a row. Every summer that stand of feverfew is in the same place, and every summer the water level is different, and every year I manage to misjudge it at least once. She shook her head slightly. My mother would have laughed at me too. She had a very practical sense of humor. Walsh, who had been listening without appearing to listen, said, good quality. Jesse was quiet. He was thinking about what it cost to keep laughing at things. He'd met men, plenty of them, in the war, and after who'd had the laugh taken out of them by accumulated weight. Men who weren't broken exactly, weren't violent or destroyed, just gone quiet in a place that had used to make noise. He recognized that quiet because he'd felt it moving into him, especially in the years right after the war. And he'd spent years not sure whether he was keeping it at bay or just postponing it. Walsh poured more coffee without asking, and Eli started telling a story about a horse he'd tried to shoe last spring that had opinions about the left rear hoof specifically. And the story was long and had 3 parts and ended with Eli sitting in a water trough, and Walsh's silence was the amused kind throughout. The fire burned lower. At some point, Maeve looked at Jesse and said, quietly enough that it was its own conversation, within the larger one, you've been here 4 days. What do you think of it? The ranch? The valley, Oakhaven. He thought about it, honestly. Pretty country, he said. The canyon's something. The people seem solid for the most part. He paused. The water situation worries me. She turned toward him slightly. You've been thinking about it? Hard not to. He looked at the coffee in his cup. The creek's not just low. It's running wrong. The flow pattern's changed. You can see it in the sediment line on the bank. The water used to run faster through the canyon section. Now it's creeping. He'd ridden the creek trail twice that week, both times telling himself he was just getting to know the terrain, which was a thing a person did when they were going to be working somewhere for 2 months. Something's changed above the canyon head. Maeve was listening with the full, careful attention he'd noticed in the clinic. The kind of listening that didn't just catch words, but heard what was underneath them. "Pierce wants to ride up there," she said. "He's been trying to find time. Takes half a day, at minimum. The terrain above the canyon head is rough limestone. It'd be..." He stopped himself from finishing in a particular direction. He put the cup down on the fence post beside him. "It'd be worth the ride." She looked at him without pushing. That same quality he'd noticed before she didn't reach past what someone offered, didn't pull for more than was given freely. But she heard everything that was given. "How do you gentle a horse?" she said after a moment. "That's been frightened for a long time." A real question, not a metaphor, though he thought it was possibly both. He looked at the dark shape of the far corral. The roan was visible against the lighter fence boards. A dark mass still now. You start by not asking anything of it. No demands, no expectations. You just exist nearby, consistently, so it learns that your presence means nothing bad is coming. He turned the empty cup over in his hands. Then, when it's curious enough to come to you, you let it set the pace. You don't reach for it. You let it reach. And it works? Every time, if you're patient enough. She looked at the corral, too. The roan was still. Above them, the stars had fully arrived, thick and white in the black-blue sky, the Milky Way unobscured by clouds. Out here, away from even Oak Haven's small lights, the sky was big, in a way that could feel either lonely or enormous, depending on who you were standing next to. "I think that's also what you do with people," Maeve said. "The frightened ones. You don't go at them directly. You just make sure your presence means something good might happen." She paused. "It's what Pierce does, actually. I learned it from watching him before I ever understood it as a method." Jesse thought about Crane in the clinic, about the way Maeve had spoken to him, clear, calm, without cruelty, and also without any concession to the power he was implying he had. Not aggressive, not defensive either. Something else. A third thing that he didn't have a precise word for, but could recognize. "What he said," Jesse said. "About the clinic, Sterling making improvements." Her jaw tightened briefly. The only visible sign. "Sterling's been buying land along the upper creek for 8 months. Water rights that go with the land. If you control the water in a territory like this, you control everything that depends on water, which is everything." She said it without heat, just as a structure of facts. The miners in the lower camps, the small homesteaders in the valley, they don't own rights to anything. They just use what was there. She paused. "What has been there? For as long as anyone's been here." "Until it isn't," Jesse said. "Until it isn't." Eli had let the fire go to coals and gone inside. Walsh was heading to the ranch house, his shape moving through the dark yard with the sure-footed ease of a man who knew every inch of his own ground. "Good night," Walsh said to both of them, not specifically, just to the air between them. "Good night," Maeve said. They were quiet after that. The fire was mostly coals, and the air had the particular coolness that the desert produced after dark, abrupt, and real. After the brutal heat of the day. Maeve pulled her shawl up across her shoulders. The roan made a soft noise in the dark corral, a low exhale, somewhere between contentment and comment. "He's settling," Jesse said. "The horse?" "He made that sound tonight for the first time." "Means?" "He's relaxed enough to let his guard down." He watched the dark corral. Good sign. Maeve looked at the corral too, and he could see her face in profile, lit by the last of the coals, considering something. "What will you do after Walsh's contract is done?" It was a direct question, not intrusive, just direct, which was her way. He'd noticed that about her. She asked what she wanted to know, and left plenty of room to answer or not. "Move on," he said. And then, because that answer had always felt like the whole truth, and tonight it felt somehow partial. "There's a ranch in New Mexico that's been looking for someone. Letter came in March. Have you answered it?" "Not yet." She nodded. She looked at the coals. He looked at them too, and neither of them said anything for a bit. And the silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it had something in it, that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. A weight, or maybe just a density, like something gaining substance. "What made you stay in the canyon this afternoon?" she asked. "After the crossing. You didn't have to walk in." Jesse thought about how to answer that honestly, without saying more than he was ready to say. "Didn't seem like a good time to move on," he said finally. She turned her head and looked at him with those sandstone eyes, warmer in the firelight, and he held the look longer than he usually held anything. He was aware of the distance between them, 2 feet, maybe a little less, and aware that he wasn't moving away from it. "Thank you," she said, "for the gelding and for being here." "The gelding was just work," he said. "I know," she said. "I meant the other part." The coals glowed, and the stars turned overhead, and the roan was still and quiet in his corral, and Jesse Kincaid sat with the warmth of the dying fire on his face, and thought that he had not written back to the ranch in New Mexico, and that this did not, right now, feel like an oversight. Maeve picked up her satchel and her basket and he stood with her, and they walked together to the yard gate where she'd left her horse tied to the post. She untied the reins and gathered them and looked at him one more time. "I'll come back Thursday," she said, "to check the gelding's fetlock." "I'll be here," he said. It was a simple thing to say. He'd said versions of it 100 times. But he meant it more specifically tonight than he had in years, and he thought she heard the specificity because she nodded once in that quiet way and rode out the gate and down the road toward Oakhaven, and Jesse watched the dark shape of her go until the road bent and the cottonwoods took her from sight. He went back to the corral fence. The roan came and stood 10 feet away, regarding him in the dark with that sideways equine awareness, and Jesse stood there with his hands in his pockets, and the stars overhead, and the desert cooling around him. "I know," he said to the horse. The roan snorted. "I know," Jesse said again, quieter, and went inside. The dam went in quietly. That was the thing about it. No announcement, no public works notice, no conversation with the county recorder's office that anyone outside Sterling's operation was invited to attend. One week the upper Sunstone Creek ran the way it always had, thin, yes, thinner than prior summers, but still moving with the particular persistence of water that knows where it's going. The next week, the creek below the canyon head dropped to a trickle that a man could step across without wetting his boots above the ankle. Jesse rode the upper trail on a Monday morning in late July, not because anyone had asked him to, not entirely, but because the pattern had been sitting in his head like a splinter, and he'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to stop thinking about something was to go look at it directly. He found it about 4 miles above the canyon head, a diversion dam, rough-built but functional, the kind of structure that took money and labor and planning rather than expertise or elegance. Logs and packed stone and river clay thrown across the narrowest point of the creek where the limestone walls pinched close on both sides. A channel cut from the impounded water, running northwest toward higher ground, following the grade toward Sterling's mining operation, where the ore processing required water by the barrel. Jesse sat on the buckskin and looked at it for a long time. The impounded water was already spreading into a flat pool behind the dam, finding every low spot in the terrain. Below the dam, the creek bed was mostly dry. A thin seep came through the base. Water always found its way eventually, but it was a fraction of what should have been moving. Maybe 1 part in 10 of the natural flow. He rode back to Oakhaven and went directly to Pierce's clinic. Maeve was in the dispensary, reorganizing the herb inventory that she reorganized every Monday, because the weekend cases always disrupted the arrangement. She heard his boots and came to the doorway. She saw his face and came the rest of the way into the room. "You found something," she said. "Diversion dam, 4 miles above the canyon head." He held his hat in both hands. "Logs and clay and stone. Sends the water northwest toward the mining site. It's been there long enough for the pool behind it to stabilize." He paused. 2 weeks, maybe 3. The clinic was quiet. Pierce was at a homestead 2 miles out, doing a call he'd be back from by noon. The 3 cots in the main room were occupied 2 miners from the South Camp, with fever symptoms that kept presenting faster than they could be managed, and an elderly woman from the valley floor, a Mrs. Garza, who was dehydrated badly enough that Pierce had kept her overnight. Maeve looked at Mrs. Garza. Then she looked back at Jesse. "Sterling," she said. "His land up there, his operation." Jesse set his hat on the bench by the door. "It's a diversion, not a storage dam. He's not trying to hold the water, he's rerouting it. Sends the flow northwest, uses it for ore processing, and what's left is whatever seeps through the base. Can it be reversed, physically? You pull the upstream sluice gate, and the water goes back to the creek. 15 minutes of work." He looked at her steadily. "But it's on his land, is it?" She said this quietly, but with a specific edge, and he understood that she knew something he didn't. "Pierce has maps?" "Pierce has a letter from the county recorder's office." She went to the back room and came back with a folded document, spreading it on the examination table. It was a copy of a land survey, the lines hand-drawn and faded at the creases. "This is the original grant map for the Upper Sunstone watershed, filed in 1861. She pointed to a section of the map where 2 property lines converged near the creek's upper course. "Sterling's deed covers this parcel here. The creek itself, the water and the banks for 20 feet on each side, is classified as public use waterway under the Territorial Treaty of 1863. Jesse bent over the map. He'd read enough survey documents during the war, moving cavalry through contested territory, to follow the line notations and boundary markers. He traced the property line with 1 finger, then found the creek's marked course. The dam site he'd visited was inside the 20-foot buffer zone, inside the public waterway classification. Clearly, specifically, inside it. "Pierce knows about this. He's known since last week. He's been trying to determine the right authority to report it to." She folded the map carefully. "The county recorder hasn't answered his second letter. The territorial marshal's office is in Tucson. 3-day ride, 2.5 if you push." She set the map on the corner shelf. "Pierce is being methodical. He wants to be certain before he makes accusations against a man with Sterling's resources." Jesse understood that. You didn't go at a man like Sterling without being certain, because if you missed, he'd use the miss to close off every other avenue you might have taken. That was how power worked when it had time to arrange itself. "How are the camps?" he asked. Her jaw set briefly. "Come see." She took him to the South Camp that afternoon. It was a 10-minute walk from the clinic, down the valley's east side, where the creek's lower channel had historically run accessible and clean. The camp was 40 or 50 people, migrant miners and their families, housed in canvas tents and 2 long, plank-sided bunkhouses that Sterling's operation nominally provided as part of the labor arrangement. The creek channel at the camp's edge was nearly dry. A few dark pools sat in the low spots, still and stagnant in the July heat. Children who should have been playing near the water's edge were instead kept back from it by parents who'd learned what the doctor had told them. Standing water in this heat was not safe. Julian Ruiz met them at the camp's entrance. He'd aged in a way that wasn't about years, since Jesse had first seen him. There was a compression in his face, a controlled urgency, the look of a man managing a complex and worsening situation with insufficient tools. He shook Jesse's hand with a grip that was firm and brief. 3 more since Sunday, he said. He was talking to Maeve, but he included Jesse without discussion, which meant Maeve had said something to him about Jesse's trustworthiness, or Julian was a judge of character who read quickly, possibly both. Old Mendez is the worst. He's not young, and he's been drinking the pool water because he stopped, and there was something in the stop that wasn't frustration so much as grief, because there isn't enough of the other kind. Maeve went immediately toward the tent Julian indicated. Jesse followed, 1 step back, watching. Inside, an older man lay on a cot with the particular stillness of a body that is using every resource it has for internal work and has none left for surface presentation. His wife sat beside him, a small woman who held his hand with both of hers, and looked at Maeve when she entered with an expression of hope, so stripped of embellishment that it was painful to see. Maeve spoke to her quietly in Spanish. Jesse didn't catch all of it. His Spanish was serviceable rather than fluent, but he caught agua limpia and esta noche and no se preocupe, and the woman's shoulders, which had been up around her ears, came down slightly. Maeve checked the man's eyes, his pulse, the color of his lips. She opened her satchel and produced a cloth packet of dried herbs, speaking to Julian as she worked. This is for oral rehydration. You add it to boiled water, let it cool, have him drink small amounts continuously. Don't wait until he asks. Every 15 minutes, whether he asks or not. She looked at the wife. Every 15 minutes. She held up her fingers. Quince minutos. The woman nodded. Maeve showed her the amounts, patiently and without rush, demonstrating twice until she was certain the information had moved from hearing to understanding. The difference between those two things, Jesse had observed, was something Maeve paid careful attention to. Hearing was easy. Understanding took time and repetition and the willingness of the teacher to go again. They moved through 4 more tents in the next hour. 2 children with low-grade fever, responding well to the willow bark preparation. A young man with a rash on his forearms that Maeve identified as a reaction to the contaminated water, not infection, and treated with a poultice that she explained to Julian in terms specific enough to be repeated correctly. A woman with a headache that had lasted 3 days, for whom Maeve left feverfew and strict instructions to stay out of the midday heat. Jesse carried the satchel. He didn't offer, he just took it when her hands were full the 3rd time. And after that, it was simply the arrangement. When they came out of the last tent, Julian walked with them to the camp's edge and stood looking at the dry creek bed. "We've been here 4 years," he said. "My crew and I. This operation." He wasn't speaking to Jesse specifically, but he wasn't excluding him either. "We've sent money home to Sonora. Built something. Our children know this valley." He looked at the stagnant pool in the creek's low spot, dark, and still in the afternoon sun. "Sterling wants us gone. Not somewhere else in the valley. Gone. He doesn't have the legal authority to remove you," Maeve said. "Your labor contracts are with the mining company, not with Sterling personally. Sterling is the mining company." Julian's voice was flat. He replaced the manager in March. Anyone in the crew who asked questions about terms found their hours cut. He looked at Jesse. "You work for Walsh?" "I do. Walsh is a good man. He's not touched by all this yet." Julian turned back to the dry creek. Yet. Jesse thought about what that word carried. How quickly a yet could become a now in a territory where one man controlled the water, and another man held the contracts, and a third man had the guns. He thought about Crane's face in the clinic, positioned to benefit. The sun was high, and the heat pressed down in a flat, serious way. The mountains north of the valley were blue-gray in the distance, hazy, their snowmelt running somewhere it shouldn't. "I need to get back," Maeve said. She looked at Jesse. "Will you come to the clinic tomorrow morning?" "I'm working the roan until noon." "After noon, then?" She held his look. "Pierce will want to hear what you saw up there." He nodded. On the walk back to Oakhaven, Maeve was quiet in a different way than she'd been quiet on other evenings. Working something. He left her to it. They parted at the clinic's red door, and Jesse went back to Walsh's ranch and spent the evening with the roan, who was allowing touch now, brief contact on the shoulder and neck, the horse leaning slightly into Jesse's hand, with the tentative trust of an animal beginning to believe that reach might be safe. Jesse worked him quietly in the corral until the sun went down, and then stood at the fence in the dark and turned the day over in his mind. Sterling came to him the following morning. Jesse was at the near barn checking the bay gelding's fetlock healing. Well, the drawing salve had done its work when he heard the horses come into the yard. Not Walsh's horses, not the familiar cadence of the ranch's regular traffic. These were well-shod animals moving fast, then pulled to a stop. He came out of the barn. There were 4 of them, the 2 riders in the canvas dusters he'd seen before, at the canyon and outside the clinic. A 3rd man, older, who sat his horse with the particular deliberateness of someone who expected landscapes to arrange themselves around him. And Crane, his bandaged hand resting on the saddle horn. The older man was Harlan Sterling. Jesse had formed a picture of him from the pieces he'd collected: the diversion dam, Crane's careful language, Julian's compressed expression, Maeve's jaw setting tight whenever the name came up. Sterling at 60 was a solid, well-maintained man, gray at the temples, wearing a good hat and a suit that acknowledged it was hot in Arizona and declined to apologize for its own quality anyway. His face had the set of a man who had spent decades making decisions and having those decisions stand, and who had developed, from this experience, a certainty about his own judgment that had long since stopped being tested against reality. He looked at Jesse the way he looked at everything: value, calculating use. Kincaid, he said. He knew the name, which was itself information. Mr. Sterling. Jesse stayed where he was, between the barn door and the yard. He didn't reach for anything or move toward anything. Just stood. I hear you've been riding the Upper Creek Trail. Sterling's voice was conversational. Easy. The kind of easy that took practice to produce. I ride a lot of trails, Jesse said. Territory's new to me. Of course. Sterling looked around the yard with apparent appreciation. Walsh keeps a fine operation. Good man. He looked back at Jesse. You're doing good work here. Word gets around. Jesse waited. I'm expanding my operation, Sterling said. Building a private rail spur north from Oakhaven to connect with the main line at Flagstaff. It's going to open this valley up in ways that'll benefit everyone who's here. He let that word do its Sterling work, benefit, with its unstated complement. Who qualifies? I need reliable men. Men with military backgrounds. Good with terrain. Good with difficult situations. Crane tells me you're that kind of man. Crane saw me at a clinic, Jesse said. That's a limited sample. A brief acknowledgement moved through Sterling's expression, possibly appreciation for the precision. I'd pay double what Walsh is paying. Likely more. He paused, letting the number imply itself. The work is straightforward. Escort, logistics, some property management. Property management, Jesse said, managing access to Sterling Company properties, making sure they stay secure, and that access is limited to authorized parties. Sterling tilted his head slightly. It's not complicated work for the right man. Jesse understood what was being offered. He understood it specifically, and completely. Escort meant presence, logistics meant muscle. Property management meant standing between the water and the people who needed it, and it paid double because the man doing it had to be willing to look the other way hard enough that he couldn't see what he was doing. He also understood what came at the end of that speech. It wasn't a job offer, primarily. It was a warning with a job offer built around it, so it had somewhere polite to go if it needed to. I'm going to have to decline, Jesse said. The air in the yard didn't change. Sterling's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. Fair enough, Sterling said pleasantly. A man's got his commitments. He gathered his reins. I'd say, enjoy the valley while you're here, Kincaid. But between you and me, the valley's going to look different in a few months than it does right now. He looked at the mountains north of the ranch, at the blue haze over the canyon. Things change. It's the nature of progress. He turned his horse and rode out, his men falling in behind him. Crane was last. He looked at Jesse with the specific look of a man filing information, for later use, professional and cold. Jesse watched them go down the ranch road until the dust settled. Walsh came out of the ranch house and stood on the porch, watching the departing riders with the silence that was now clearly the thoughtful kind rather than the approving one. He offered you work, Walsh said. Not a question. He did. Walsh was quiet for a moment. He came to me last month. Wanted to buy the east pasture, the section along the creek tributary. He paused. I told him it wasn't for sale. Jesse looked at him. What'd he say? Walsh's mouth turned at one corner. He said he admired a man who knew the value of what he had. He went back inside. Jesse went to Oak Haven at midday, as he'd said he would, arriving at the clinic to find Pierce sitting at his desk with the land survey map spread out and a second document beside it, a handwritten set of notes in Pierce's careful, angular hand. Maeve was standing at his shoulder, reading along. Pierce looked up when Jesse entered. Tell me exactly what you saw. Jesse told it, the way he'd been trained to report terrain, specifically and in order. Location relative to the canyon head, 4 miles northeast. The dam's construction materials and approximate dimensions. The diversion channel's course northwest toward the mining site. The state of the creek below the dam. He'd estimated the impounded water's surface area, which gave Pierce an indication of how long the dam had been in place. He described the sluice gate, a simple mechanism. One man could operate it in minutes. Pierce listened without interrupting, taking notes. Inside the buffer zone, Pierce said when Jesse finished. He wasn't asking. He was confirming what the map already told him, now matched against first-hand observation. No question about it, Jesse said. Pierce sat back. He looked at his notes, then at the map, then at Maeve. A conversation passed between them, without words, the shorthand of two people who'd worked alongside each other, long enough to compress a lot of exchange into a glance. I have a contact in Tucson, Pierce said, a land attorney who has dealt with territorial treaty violations before. I've been hesitant to involve him without certainty. He looked at Jesse. You've given me the certainty. Sterling will know the complaint's been made, Maeve said. Her voice was even, but Jesse heard the calculation in it. She was thinking ahead, past the complaint, to what Sterling would do when he knew the complaint was coming. He'll know, Pierce agreed. He came to Walsh's ranch this morning, Jesse said. Both of them looked at him. He gave them the conversation, Sterling offer his own refusal. The parting words about the valley looking different in a few months. Maeve looked at the map. Pierce looked at his notes. The clinic was quiet around them, the two miners sleeping. Mrs. Garza, sitting up and drinking the clean water Maeve had left within reach, improved enough from yesterday that her eyes were tracking. He's not going to wait for a legal challenge to run its course, Maeve said. He's going to move faster, buy what he can, pressure what he can't buy, and be so far done with the thing by the time any complaint reaches a territorial judge that undoing it costs more than it's worth. Pierce nodded slowly. Which means we can't be slow either. Jesse stood by the door with his hat in his hands. He'd been calculating something since the ranch yard, since Sterling's easy voice and that word progress, delivered the way a man delivers a word he's trained to believe in. So completely, he's never once had to defend it to himself. He thought about the stagnant pool in the creek bed at the South Camp. Mendy's lying on his cot, his wife's hands around his, 3 more since Sunday. Julian's face controlled and wearying. He thought about his own rule, the one he'd built carefully over 9 years, and maintained carefully and never seriously tested, because he'd always had the option to move on before the test arrived. Keep your head down, and look out for yourself. He thought about Walsh's east pasture. About the letter from New Mexico, he still hadn't answered. Write to your attorney, Jesse said to Pierce. Today. And send the survey map with it. Full copy. Everything you've got. Pierce looked at him. You're staying. It wasn't quite a question. And Jesse didn't quite answer it. I'm saying you shouldn't wait, he said. Sterling didn't come to Walsh's ranch to offer me work. He came to find out which direction I was going to go. Now he knows, and he's going to move before you do, if you give him the time. He set his hat on. I need to get back to the roan. He went out. On the boardwalk outside, he stood for a moment in the full, flat press of the July heat. Down the main street, Sterling's men were visible outside the hotel, standing, talking, the studied casualness of men posted rather than resting. He looked at them for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward Walsh's ranch, and he did not look at the road to New Mexico. and he did not think about how much easier everything would be if he were somewhere else by now. He thought about Maeve's voice in the South Camp. "No se preocupe. Don't worry," said to a woman with no cause to stop worrying, and said anyway, with enough steadiness behind it to be worth saying. He walked back to the ranch in the heat. The roan met him at the fence. The storm came without much warning, which was the desert's habit. There'd been signs, if you knew how to read them, a particular heaviness in the air. By late afternoon, the smell of rain on hot stone, from somewhere distant, the way the canyon swallows had dropped low and gone quiet an hour before sundown. Jesse had noticed all three from the roan's corral and said nothing to anyone because he'd learned, in 15 years of reading weather across 4 territories, that the gap between a storm that looked serious and a storm that was serious could go either direction, and saying so ahead of time mostly just made people anxious without giving them anything useful to do with the anxiety. By 8 o'clock that evening, the sky above Sunstone Canyon was doing something specific and purposeful. He was at Walsh's bunkhouse when Julian Ruiz rode in hard, his horse blowing and dark with sweat. Jesse heard the hooves before he saw the horse, and was already at the door when Julian came through the yard. "The auxiliary dam," Julian said, pulling up short. He was breathing fast. Sterling built a secondary structure last week smaller, up the draw northeast of the main one, poorly made. The South Camp families are in the lowlands directly below it. Jesse already had his boots on. He'd been sitting on his bunk reading, and his boots were on because of the smell of rain from the south, a habit from enough nights in campaign tents. He went to the saddle room without discussion. Walsh appeared on the ranch house porch. Jesse called to him over his shoulder what Julian had said, the location, the families in the lowlands, and Walsh was already turning back inside, calling for Eli. Jesse rode for the clinic. The wind had picked up by the time he reached Oakhaven's main street. A real wind now, not the evening cooling, but something muscular and deliberate coming down from the north. Dust moved in sheets across the road. The few people still out were moving with the hurried purposefulness of people who'd read the same signs he had and arrived at the same conclusion. Maeve was at the clinic. Of course she was. Pierce had gone home to his rooms above the hardware store at 7, and the evening watch was hers on alternate nights. And she was at the desk, writing in the case notes, when the door came open, and Jesse came in with the wind behind him. She was already standing before he spoke. He told her quickly. The secondary, Julian's assessment of its construction, the families in the low draw. He watched her face move through the information, rapidly processing, discarding the parts that weren't actionable, arriving at the center. "How many families?" she said. Julian didn't say. "Maybe 15, 20 people. There are children." She was already pulling on her coat. She took the medical satchel from the hook, checked it in 3 seconds. Her hands knew what was in it, without looking, and added a roll of clean linen from the shelf. She went to the dispensary room and came back with a flat bottle of laudanum, a smaller one of carbolic, and a paper packet of the rehydration herbs that she tucked into the satchel's side pocket. "Pierce," she said. "I'll get him on the way." Jesse held the door. "Can you ride fast?" She looked at him with an expression that asked what he thought she'd been doing for 3 years of night calls in rough country. "Bring rope," she said. "Whatever Walsh has. And lanterns. We'll need light." He went back to Walsh's ranch in a hard lope. Walsh had already roused Eli and 2 other hands. Jesse loaded rope, 3 coils of it, good hemp, and 2 lanterns, and a box of matches in a waterproof tin. Walsh said he'd ride to alert the homesteaders in the lower valley, the ones whose wells fed from the Sunstone watershed, because a dam failure would move a lot of water fast, and in directions it didn't usually go. Eli came with Jesse. By the time they reached the clinic, Maeve was out front with her horse saddled and waiting, which meant she'd either saddled it herself in the dark in under 10 minutes, or the horse had been ready. He suspected the former. She had a second lantern hung from her saddle horn, and Pierce was there too, his coat misbuttoned and his hat jammed on at an angle that said he'd dressed in the dark and moving, and none of it mattered. The five of them rode north along the canyon road, the wind pushing at their backs. The rain started 20 minutes out, not the polite, gradual kind. The kind that arrived at full commitment, the way a summer storm in Arizona arrived when it had decided it had waited long enough. It came in horizontal sheets, heavy and cold, and within 4 minutes Jesse was soaked through to the shirt, and his hat was doing nothing useful for his eyes. He could hear the water before he could see it. The draw northeast of the main canyon was a narrow limestone gorge that in dry weather was just a shadow in the rock, 20 feet wide at its widest. Tonight it was a throat. Even from a quarter-mile out, the sound coming from it had a new and serious note underneath the rain, not the rain-on-rock sound, something lower, something with weight behind it, the acoustic signature of a lot of water moving under pressure. Julian was at the draw's entrance with 4 of his men, 2 lanterns between them, the lanterns doing little against the rain except marking where they were. "The dam's holding for now," Julian said, shouting over the rain. "But the pool above it has tripled in the last hour. When it goes, it'll go all at once." He looked at the draw. "The families are in the tents at the draw's south end. We've been moving them, but the ground is mud and some of the older folks." "Show me," Maeve said. Julian led them in. The next 3 hours were the most concentrated work Jesse had done since the war, which was the only comparison available to him for that particular experience of time. Compressing into nothing but the immediate task, the next step, the next person, no gap between action and action for anything as abstract as fear or exhaustion. The tents at the south end of the draw were already taking water. The ground had gone from dirt to mud to moving water in the time it took the rain to find the low spots and commit to them. Inside the first tent were 2 families, 7 people, including a grandmother who couldn't walk quickly and a child of maybe 3 who was asleep through everything, which the adults around her were either grateful for or too busy to register. Maeve went in. First, she assessed the mobility situation in about 10 seconds, who could walk fast, who needed support, who needed to be carried, and organized it in Spanish with the rapid clarity of someone who'd thought about emergencies in advance and had a method ready. Jesse and Julian's men handled the carrying. The grandmother went on Eli's back. The sleeping child went to her father. The remaining 5 moved under their own power, Julian's men flanking them with lanterns, and they came out of the draw at a controlled pace that was faster than it looked. They went back in for the second tent, third, fourth. Between the 4th and 5th tent, the sound from above the dam changed. It had been loud. It became enormous, a deep structural roar that was less sound than physical sensation, a compression in the chest and the ground at the same time. Jesse and Julian looked at each other in the rain and didn't say anything. They went faster. The auxiliary dam gave way at just past midnight. They were clear of the draw when it went. Just barely clear, a last group of 4 from the far tent, Julian carrying a boy of 7 on his back, Jesse with a hand under an elderly man's arm, Maeve ahead of them with a lantern up and her voice steady and directing, "This way, this way. Watch the rock here," and they came out of the draw's mouth 40 seconds before the water did. The flood came through the draw with a sound like the world reconsidering its arrangements. Even from 50 yards back, on the slight rise where they'd gathered the evacuated families, Jesse felt the ground shiver. The water moved through the limestone gorge in a dark mass, carrying everything the draw had held: rocks, brush, the collapsed tent poles. The mud of the creek bed turned to slurry and spread out at the gorge's mouth into the lower flats, in a fan of dark water that caught the lantern light in broken pieces. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the child who'd slept through everything, still on her father's shoulder, woke up and said something in Spanish, and her father said something back, and she looked at the water and apparently decided this was fine and put her head back down. Maeve exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale, just the sound of a breath that had been held a little longer than usual, releasing. Jesse was looking at the evacuated group, 23 people by his count, sitting on the rise in the rain, soaked and mud-covered, some of them in nightclothes, all of them with the shaken, wide-eyed look of people who had recently been reminded of what the world could do when it wanted to. But present, all present. Pierce was moving through the group in the lantern light, checking for injuries. Julian's men were distributing blankets from the rolls. They'd had sense enough to grab from the tents before the flood, which meant Julian had been thinking 2 steps ahead, in the middle of a dark, rain-soaked emergency, which was exactly the man Julian had shown himself to be every time Jesse had encountered him. Maeve was beside Pierce, and then, not beside Pierce, she moved through the group in her own pattern, covering the people Pierce hadn't reached yet, doing the assessment he'd taught her, but in her own order, prioritizing the children and the elderly automatically. Jesse stood at the edge of the group and watched the floodwater spread across the lower flat and told himself to find something useful to do. He went to where the horses were tethered, upslope from the water's reach, and checked each one. All present, all spooked but unhurt. He gentled each in turn, a hand on the neck, a low voice. Nothing dramatic, and retied, the ones who'd pulled their knots loose in the commotion. The rain began to ease around 2 in the morning. Not stopping, just relenting, scaling back from its earlier intensity to something more sustainable. A steady drizzle that was cold and quiet compared to what had been. Julian organized the evacuation of the evacuated group to Oakhaven, to the church hall that the pastor had apparently opened up in a crisis before, because Julian knew exactly where to send them. Walsh arrived with 2 wagons from the Valley homesteads, which was more useful than anything, and the elderly and the young and the soaked were loaded in and driven to town. Pierce went with them. Maeve stayed. Jesse was at the draw's edge, surveying the damage by lantern light, when he heard her come up behind him. He'd known she was staying. She'd sent Pierce with a look that said, "Go, I'll be here, I'm needed here," without a word, and he hadn't said anything about it. They stood looking at what the water had done to the draw. The tent frames were gone. The ground was rearranged. The limestone scarred with new courses where the flood had cut fresh channels. The creek that fed through the draw was running full and fast, carrying brown water and debris. Nothing like the thin seep of 2 weeks ago, but wrong in the other direction now, too much, all at once. The consequence of Sterling's poorly built structure, holding too long and releasing everything at once. That's what happens when you divert a water system without understanding it, Maeve said. She wasn't talking to Jesse specifically, more to the landscape. The way you talk to something that's done something to you. It doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And when it finds a way through, it finds it all at once. Jesse thought this was true of more than water, but didn't say so. "Everyone's accounted for," he said. "Everyone." She held the lantern lower to look at the ground, checking. "The man you were helping, Mr. Espinosa Pierce, thinks he's strained his hip. He'll need rest. He'll live? He'll complain about it for a year, which is the same thing." Jesse almost smiled. "Sounds like Pierce said that." Pierce said it. "I'm borrowing it." The rain continued, its quiet drizzle. Somewhere upstream, the real creek, the main sunstone, was running high too. They could hear it, a new fullness in the sound the canyon produced. The water table in the valley would change after a night like this, and not entirely for the worse, since some of it would reach the lower camps where it was desperately needed. The cruel irony of Sterling's bad engineering undoing itself. They made their way back along the draw's edge to the creek bank below the gorge's mouth, where the water had spread out and slowed, and the ground was wet but not moving. There was a flat section of the bank here, red sandstone, dry underneath the rock overhang that jutted out from the canyon wall. Not dry exactly, protected. The rain reached them as mist rather than drops. Julian had gone with the last wagon. Eli had ridden back to Walsh's ranch with 2 of the horses. The draw was empty of people except the two of them, and the sound of the creek, and the last of the night. Maeve sat down on the sandstone. She set the lantern beside her and looked at the water, and pushed her wet hair back from her face with both hands, and held it there for a moment, elbows up, eyes closed. Not dramatic. Just a person taking stock after a long thing. Jesse sat beside her. Not close. A few feet of red rock between them. He set his own lantern down. He was tired in a way that had reached past his muscles into something more central, the deep tiredness that came from sustained high-stakes focus. He was also, underneath that, awake in a different way, alert to the specific present in a manner that the regular workday didn't produce. The creek moved past them, full and fast and purposeful. "You could have left," Maeve said. She'd put her hands down. She was looking at the water. "When Sterling came to Walsh's ranch, you could have moved on." "I didn't." "I know you didn't." She looked at him then. Her face was wet with rain, and she had mud on her left temple, and she looked in the lantern's uneven light, like exactly who she was, tired and present, and not pretending to be anything else. "I wanted to say that I noticed." Jesse looked at the creek. He was aware of having been seen, which was different from being looked at, and he was trying to decide how he felt about it. What he arrived at, after a moment, was that he didn't mind. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he actively didn't mind. "The South Camp," he said. "Mendez, Julian's crew, Walsh's east pasture." He paused. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my problem." And he looked at her, didn't take. She held his look. The rain came in off the canyon rim as mist, catching the lantern light in tiny points. The creek ran steady between them and the opposite bank. He reached over and put his hand against her jaw, carefully, and she didn't pull back. Her face was cold from the rain, and he was probably cold too, and neither of them cared about that. He closed the distance between them and kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything. No hesitation, no performance, just the real thing plainly done. The creek ran past, and the rain fell softly, and the lanterns held their ground against the dark. When they separated, it wasn't far. The space between them on the red sandstone had gone from 3 feet to nothing, and it stayed at nothing, because neither of them moved to reestablish it. "I kept moving," Jesse said quietly, "for 9 years, after the war. I told myself it was practical, smart, that a man without attachments was a man who couldn't be used against." He paused. "But there's a point where practical and cowardice look so much alike you lose track of which one you're doing." Maeve was quiet for a moment. "Which one were you doing?" "Both, I think. For a long time." He looked at the water. "I'm done with the second one." She looked at him with those warm, steady eyes, the ones that had first found him at the creek bank in the canyon mud, amused and direct. She looked at him the way she looked at everything she was deciding to take seriously. "That's a thing worth saying," she said. "I mean it. I know you mean it." She leaned her head against his shoulder briefly, and it was brief, a real gesture rather than a long one, and it said more than a long one would have. Then she sat upright again and looked at the creek and said, "The dam destroyed itself tonight, but the main dam is still there." "Yes, and Sterling will use the flood as an excuse. He'll say it was the weather, the natural creek surge. He'll rebuild the auxiliary structure. Better this time, maybe. Probably." Pierce's letter to the land attorney went out 3 days ago. She was thinking ahead, organizing. He recognized this as simply how she moved through the world present in the moment. Then, looking past it to what needed doing next. We need the response before Sterling moves. And we need evidence that survives Sterling moving. The survey map alone isn't enough. We need someone who's actually seen the dam. "I've seen it," Jesse said. She looked at him. "You'd testify to that?" "I'd testify to what I saw. A diversion dam 4 miles above the canyon head, inside the 20-foot public waterway buffer, diverting the creek flow northwest toward the Sterling mining operation." He said it in the flat, factual cadence of a man who'd given reports before and knew what made them stand up. I can put measurements to it, direction, construction details. Cavalry scouts learn to document terrain for exactly this kind of use. Maeve was quiet. He could see her turning this over, assessing it, finding it solid. Then we need to keep you here long enough to use it, she said. There was the faintest edge of something in her voice that was not quite teasing and not quite serious, but lived in between. I told you at the fence, he said. I'll be here. She turned her head and looked at him one more time in the lantern light. And whatever she saw in his face satisfied whatever she was checking, because she nodded once in that quiet, conclusive way and turned back to the water. They sat on the red sandstone under the rock overhang as the rain gentled toward stopping, the creek full and running fast beside them, the lanterns steady, the canyon walls rising dark on both sides into a sky that was beginning, very faintly, at its easternmost edge, to differentiate itself from the night. Dawn was coming. Slowly and without fanfare, the way real things arrived in this country, not announced, just present, and then more present, until you looked up and realized the dark had been replaced by something else entirely. We should get back, Maeve said. We should, Jesse said. Neither of them moved for another minute. Then they stood and picked up the lanterns and walked back along the creek bank toward Oakhaven, where the day was already beginning its work without them and would need them both shortly. Jesse walked beside her on the wet red earth, and the canyon carried their footsteps, and he felt, for the first time in 9 years, like a man who was walking toward something rather than away. 3 days after the flood, Pierce got his response from Tucson. The land attorney's name was Aldous Crane, no relation to Sterling's man. A coincidence that Pierce noted with dry humor and moved past, and his letter ran 4 pages in a precise, close hand that suggested a man who charged by the case rather than the page and therefore had no incentive to be brief. Maeve read it at the clinic desk while Pierce stood at the window watching the street, and Jesse sat on the bench by the door with his hat on his knee. The letter was careful and thorough, and at its core, definitive. The public waterway classification in the 1863 Territorial Treaty was not ambiguous. The 20-foot buffer was not a suggestion. The diversion of a classified public waterway for private commercial use without a territorial water use permit, which Sterling did not have, because no such permit had been filed, which Aldous Crane had verified, with 3 separate offices in Tucson, constituted a clear violation of territorial treaty law. The remedy was removal of the diversion structure and restoration of the natural flow. The enforcement mechanism was the territorial marshal's office. The required documentation was a sworn affidavit from a credible witness who had personally observed the dam. Maeve set the letter down. He says a cavalry scout with a record of service constitutes a credible witness, she said. She looked at Jesse. I'll swear the affidavit, Jesse said. He'd said he would, and he'd meant it, and there was nothing further to discuss on that point. Pierce turned from the window. He had the survey map under his arm, the copy he'd been keeping at the clinic rather than at his rooms, because the clinic's adobe walls felt more secure than a door with a standard lock. Over the past week, he'd added his own annotations measurements. Julian's men had taken from the creek bank below the dam site the dates the creek had visibly dropped, the patient records showing the correlation between the water change and the onset of illness in the South Camp. It was a document with weight, legal weight, medical weight, human weight. I'll write to the territorial marshal today, Pierce said. The affidavit will need to be notarized. Judge Haverford handles that he's in Oakhaven on Fridays. That's 4 days, Maeve said. 4 days, Pierce agreed. He looked at the letter. Crane says once the marshal receives a notarized affidavit and the survey evidence, he's obligated to open an investigation. Sterling can't simply make that go away. It becomes a territorial matter. Sterling has contacts in Tucson, Jesse said. He wasn't being pessimistic, just accurate. He does, Pierce agreed, which is why we send copies to 3 separate offices simultaneously. The marshal, the Land Commissioner, and the Federal Indian Affairs Bureau, since the treaty in question involved tribal land classifications. He looked at Jesse over the top of the letter. Redundancy is not inefficiency. It's insurance. Jesse nodded. This was the kind of thinking he respected, not trusting any single path, but laying several, so that blocking one didn't block all of them. The days that followed had a particular texture. Not exactly calm, there was too much happening for calm, but organized, purposeful. Pierce drafted letters. Jesse worked with the roan, who was now accepting a saddle blanket with minimal protest and had progressed to allowing Jesse's weight briefly shifting his feet but not exploding, which was the beginning of something real. Maeve managed the clinic through a caseload that was slowly improving. As the floods swelled creek brought cleaner water to the lower valley, the stagnant pools flushed out by the surge, the natural system doing what it would do if left to itself. At night, Jesse and Maeve walked the creek bank below town sometimes, or sat on the clinic's back step with coffee. They talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, which is the natural mix of two people who are becoming essential to each other's daily life and haven't yet decided how to say that outright. He told her about the canyon country in New Mexico, what the light did there at certain hours. She told him about her mother's garden in Ireland, which she'd never seen, but which her mother described with a precision that made it vivid, the smell of wet soil and salt air together. He did not write to the New Mexico ranch. Julian came to the clinic on Wednesday evening with a different quality of urgency than his usual careful speed. He had one of his men with him, a young man named Tomas, who'd been working the Upper Creek Trail as an informal lookout. Julian had organized this himself quietly after the flood because Julian was the kind of man who filled gaps that needed filling without waiting to be asked. Tomas had seen 3 of Sterling's men on the upper trail that morning, moving northeast toward the dam site, carrying tools. He's repairing it, Jesse said. Reinforcing it, Julian corrected. He spread his hands. If he makes it stronger before the marshal's investigation begins, the violation is still there, Pierce said. The structure's presence is the violation, not its engineering quality. He paused, but a stronger structure takes longer to dismantle, and longer to dismantle means longer before the water comes back, Maeve said. Nobody argued with that. Jesse was quiet for a moment. How many men does he have up there? Tomas counted 3, Julian said, but there could be more at the site. Sterling's been moving men around since the flood. Does Crane know about the repair work? Maeve looked at Pierce. I'll add it to tomorrow's letter. Pierce stood. It may actually help the case attempting to modify an illegal structure while a legal complaint is pending is its own category of problem for Sterling. He looked at Jesse. I want to ride up there myself. Tomorrow. See the dam with my own eyes. I'll go with you, Jesse said, immediately. And me, Maeve said. Pierce looked at her with the expression of a man who knew better than to argue with that particular tone of voice. We go early, he said, before the heat. They rode out at 5:30 Thursday morning, the 3 of them, the canyon still in blue shadow, the air sharp enough to remind you that desert nights were not playing. Pierce on his steady gray mare, Maeve on the sorrel she'd been riding 3 years, Jesse on the buckskin. Julian had offered 2 of his men as escort, and Jesse had accepted, because not accepting would have been foolish, and the 5 of them rode the upper trail in a quiet group as the sun came up behind the canyon's eastern rim and turned the sandstone from blue to orange. They reached the dam site in just under 2 hours. Sterling's men had been there, all right. Fresh timber across the dam face, new clay packed into the gaps, the sluice gate reinforced with iron bracings that hadn't been there when Jesse had first found the structure. The pool behind it had rebuilt itself since the flood, the creek resuming its impoundment, now that the secondary dam was gone and the main one was holding stronger than before. Pierce stood at the dam's edge for a long time. He looked at the structure, then at the survey map he'd brought folded in his jacket pocket, then at the canyon walls, then at the creek below the dam, which ran at its old thin seep. I wanted to see it, he said, not to anyone specifically. I wanted to understand what I'm writing about. Now you understand, Jesse said. Now I understand. Pierce folded the map. His jaw was set in the precise, controlled way Maeve recognized as his version of anger, compressed into a small space and made useful rather than expressed. Let's go back. They rode back to Oakhaven in good time. Pierce went directly to his desk. Jesse returned to Walsh's ranch for the afternoon work. Maeve ran the clinic through the day's cases, which were milder now: a burn, a sprained ankle from a homesteader's boy who'd taken a fence wrong. Petrovich finally recovered enough to be discharged with a handshake and a cheerful good morning delivered at 2 in the afternoon. The letters went out Friday. Pierce rode to the post office himself, sent 3 packets simultaneously by separate riders: Tucson, Prescott, the Federal Bureau office in Santa Fe. The notary affidavit from Judge Haverford was included in each, Jesse's signature on each copy in the same careful, military precise hand that appeared in cavalry reports and meant what it said. Pierce came back to the clinic that afternoon, looking like a man who'd set something in motion that he couldn't stop, which was exactly what he'd done, and he was at peace with it. Now we wait, he said. How long? Maeve asked. 10 days to Tucson by the fast rider, 2 weeks for a response. A month, realistically, before the marshal moves. He sat down at his desk. Sterling will know. He has contacts in every post office from here to Prescott, I'd wager. He'll know a packet left. He'll know we know, Jesse said from the doorway. He'd stopped in on his way back from Walsh's to check on the progress. He was waiting to see if we'd act. Now he knows. The clinic was quiet for a moment. We should secure the evidence, Maeve said. The originals, the map, the attorney's letter, the patient records. She looked at Pierce. If Sterling decides the legal process isn't working in his favor, he decides to remove the evidence, Pierce finished. Or the people with it, Jesse said. He said it plainly, without drama, because it was a plain fact and pretending otherwise helped no one. Pierce looked at him, looked at Maeve. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who has just heard something he'd been half thinking and is now confronting it fully. I'll keep the originals at the clinic. The adobe is solid. The door locks. I'll stay close, Jesse said. This week. Maeve looked at him. He met her eyes and held them, and the look said what it needed to without taking long. Friday passed. Sunday was quiet. The canyon. Quiet. The town quiet. The particular stillness of a place catching its breath between things. Jesse worked the roan, and the horse now moved under him in the corral at a walk, uncertain but willing. The trust built one slow hour at a time, paying out in something real. Walsh watched from the fence and said nothing, which was the approving kind. Monday night, the wind changed. Jesse woke in the bunkhouse at some hour past midnight. He lay still and listened, the way he'd woken for 15 years, not gradually, not with the fog of a normal sleep, but all the way awake in a single moment, every sense already working. The wind had been from the south. Now it was from the east, and it carried something. Smoke. He was out of the bunk and through the door before his boots were fully on. He stood in the ranch yard and looked at Oakhaven's lights. Half a mile west, and above the clinic's general direction, the sky had a color that night sky didn't usually have. Orange. Low and spreading. He ran for the corral. He came into Oakhaven's main street at a full gallop, and the fire was already something to see. The clinic's roof was going the wooden roof structure above the adobe walls, dry as tinder in the summer heat, and someone had known that when they set it, because the fire was loudest at the roof's center and the walls were only catching at the window frames. It wasn't an accidental fire. The distribution was wrong for an accident. 3 separate points of origin, Jesse saw from the street, which meant 3 separate starts, which meant planning and timing, and people who'd known the clinic would be lightly staffed at this hour. People were coming into the street. Shouts, the sound of a bucket brigade trying to organize itself. Jesse went off the horse before it fully stopped stopped and went directly for the clinic's red door. The door was hot. Not handle hot, door hot, which meant the fire was well established inside, not just on the roof. He stepped back, pulled his coat over his face, and hit the door with his shoulder. It gave. The inside of the clinic was a version of itself, made terrible the shape of the room, still visible through the smoke. The cots still in their places, the instrument cabinet a dark shape against the back wall, but all of it obscured and dimmed and fouled by thick gray-black smoke that had a different weight than air, that pushed down instead of rising, that filled the space from the ceiling and was already at eye level and dropping. Pierce was at the far end of the room at his desk, not burning, not unconscious, standing, with the map satchel in one hand and his other hand against the wall for balance, coughing steadily, and through the smoke and the noise of the fire in the roof above them, Jesse could hear that Pierce was still on his feet and moving. He crossed the room fast, under the worst of the smoke, and got a hand on Pierce's arm. Pierce shoved the satchel at him. Heavy, it had everything in it, every document, both copies of the attorney's letter, the patient records, the original annotated survey map. Jesse could feel the papers inside through the canvas. "Take it," Pierce said. His voice was wrecked from smoke, but steady underneath. "Maeve, is she inside?" She was in the dispensary. Jesse was already moving. He shoved the satchel back into Pierce's hands. "Get out. Now, door is behind you. Go," and went for the dispensary. The canvas curtain between the main room and the dispensary was on fire at its upper edge. He went through low, below the fire line, into the smaller room. Maeve was there on her feet, which meant she'd been aware and moving, not caught asleep. She had a cloth over her face and a second satchel, her medical satchel, over one shoulder, and she was at the dispensary's small window, which was too small to climb through, but which she'd managed to get open, providing a thin pull of outside air that kept the room marginally breathable. She turned when he came through the curtain. Her eyes went to his face, then to the burning curtain behind him, and she moved immediately. He grabbed her arm, and they went back through the curtain together, through the smoke toward the orange-lit rectangle of the open front door. Pierce was through. Jesse could see the gap where the old man had gone, could hear voices outside. He pushed Maeve ahead, kept his hand on her back, and they came through the door into the night air. And both of them went to their knees in the dirt, coughing. Someone had a bucket, water on his back, on his shoulders, on Maeve's hair, people around them, voices, hands. Jesse got upright. He looked at Maeve on her knees still, coughing, but lifting her face, eyes open, the medical satchel still over her shoulder, because she'd kept it through everything. He looked for Pierce. Pierce was 10 feet away. On the ground, Julian Ruiz was beside him, kneeling, and Julian's face in the firelight told Jesse before he reached them that something had gone wrong in the last 60 seconds. He went to Pierce and crouched, and what he saw was the blood, dark across the front of Pierce's coat, and Pierce's face, which was conscious but working hard at it. Pierce's free hand was pressed to his side. The satchel was still in his other hand, clutched against his chest, a bullet, while Jesse had been in the dispensary, while Pierce had been standing in the burning clinic door, waiting to know Maeve was out. Someone in the crowd, or the dark, beside the building had put a bullet in Gideon Pierce. "The satchel," Pierce said. His voice was thin. He was looking at Maeve, who had reached them now, who was already doing what she did her, hands moving, evaluating, her face controlled. Maeve, the satchel. She took it from him. She held his hand with her other hand and looked at the wound, and her face went very still, the stillness of someone who sees something serious and is determining what to do with that information before allowing themselves to feel it. "You're going to be all right," she said. "Don't." Pierce started, and then he coughed, and the cough was bad, and he said, "Don't be inaccurate." "You're not going to die in the street," she said, more specifically. "I won't allow it." She looked at Julian, his rooms above the hardware store. Now Julian had 2 men with him. They moved. Jesse stood. He stood with both satchels. He'd taken the document one from Pierce. Maeve had her medical one, and looked at the burning clinic, which was fully involved now, the roof coming down in sections, the wooden interior gutted, the adobe walls standing but emptied. The bucket brigade had given up on saving it and was concentrating on the building next door. He looked at the street, at the faces in the firelight, at the darkness beyond the firelight, where anyone with any sense who'd done what had been done here would already have gone. He couldn't see Sterling's men, not specifically. But the fire was not a natural fire, and the bullet was not a stray bullet, and both had arrived on the same night that 3 packets of legal evidence had been posted to 3 territorial offices. And none of that was coincidence. The clinic burned. The smoke went up in a thick column against the stars. The street was full of people and light and noise, and in the middle of all of it, Jesse Kincaid stood with the evidence satchel under his arm, and the anger moving through him, cold and specific, and nothing at all like the cynicism he'd carried for 9 years. This was different. This had direction. He turned toward the hardware store, toward Pierce and Maeve and the work that needed doing. Behind him, the clinic's roof came down with a long, heavy sound, and the fire found new things to say. He didn't die that night. That was the first thing Jesse confirmed. When he came through the hardware store's back door at just past 3 in the morning, having spent the prior 2 hours doing 3 things simultaneously, watching the street, watching the dark beyond the street, and watching the hardware store's upper windows for any change in the light that would tell him something had gone wrong up there. The light had stayed steady. Oil lamp, warm and yellow, visible from the alley. Julian was at the bottom of the interior stairs when Jesse came in. His face in the low light was composed in the way that meant the situation was serious but stable. Because Julian Ruiz's face in an unstable situation looked different, tighter, more kinetic, the eyes moving rather than fixed. "She's got the bullet out," Julian said quietly. "He's awake." Jesse let out a breath he'd been managing carefully for 2 hours. The bleeding stopped. She packed the wound with something. Julian paused. She was talking to him the whole time, explaining what she was doing, every step. He said this with a particular quality, not surprise exactly, more like recognition of something that deserved naming. Pierce kept arguing with her about her technique. "That's a good sign," that's what she said. Jesse went up the stairs. Pierce's rooms were modest and organized in the way of a man who valued function and had no energy left over for decoration. A bed, a desk stacked with books and journals, a washstand, 1 chair. The chair had been moved to the bedside, and Maeve was in it. She was still in her coat, which was scorched at the left sleeve, and she had blood on her hands that she'd mostly washed off, but not entirely. She was watching Pierce with the steady, evaluating attention of someone who had finished the acute work and was now in the harder phase, the waiting. Pierce was in the bed, propped on 2 pillows, pale in a way that was concerning, but not dire. His eyes were open and tracking. He looked at Jesse when Jesse appeared in the doorway. "You pulled her out," he said. His voice was rough from smoke, but direct. "She was already moving," Jesse said. "I just came along." The satchel. Jesse held it up. Pierce's eyes confirmed the familiar canvas shape, and some visible tension left his face. The way a man's face changes when he learns the thing he was most worried about is still intact. "The letters went out Friday," Maeve said, "to Pierce, but also for Jesse's benefit. Sterling can burn the originals. The copies are already in the mail. He knows that," Jesse said. He came fully into the room. "That's not why he burned it." Pierce looked at him. "The clinic was a message," Jesse said. "The bullet was a message. He's telling us what he's willing to do." He set the satchel on Pierce's desk, carefully, next to a stack of medical journals. "The question is what he does next." "Maeve," Pierce said. She looked at him. "He took her," Jesse said, because Pierce's face had asked a question before Pierce finished asking it. "They've taken Maeve." He stopped, corrected himself. That was wrong. Maeve was in the chair, 3 feet from him. He'd been running 2 conversations at once, the present one and the one he'd been conducting in his head, since the burning street, the one where he was already thinking ahead to what came next if Sterling moved from property to people. He looked at Maeve. She looked back at him steadily, reading something in his face. "He'll try," Jesse said. "If the legal challenge moves forward, if the marshal responds to the letters, Sterling's going to need a different kind of leverage." He paused. "The evidence in that satchel can hurt him in a courtroom, but people are a different kind of pressure." The room was quiet. Pierce moved his hand slightly on the blanket. It was the movement of a man who wanted to sit up straighter and was being informed by his body that this was not currently an option. "You need to get her somewhere. Sterling's men can't reach her while I can't." He stopped, looked at the ceiling, coming to terms visibly with a physical reality he had no patience for. "While I'm limited, I'm not leaving you," Maeve said immediately. "Maeve. Gideon." She said his first name the way she said it. When the conversation was between them directly, Daktaha to protege, without the professional frame. "You have a bullet wound in your side and 3 broken ribs from where you hit the door frame going out." "I'm not going anywhere. Julian can." "Julian is not a doctor." She said this without heat, just as a fact. "And neither are you right now. You're a patient." She folded her hands in her lap. The conversation was finished from her end, apparently. Pierce looked at Jesse with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and something that might have been pride. "She's been like this since she was 17, he said. "I can hear you," Maeve said. Jesse pulled the washstand stool to the opposite side of the bed and sat on it. He was tired in a way that had gone past the physical and into something structural. But his mind was running clean and fast, the same clarity he'd had in the war, when a situation stripped everything down to what mattered and what didn't. "Tell me about the ore camp," he said. Pierce and Maeve both looked at him. Sterling's remote processing site, the one north of the main operation. He'd heard it mentioned. Julian had referenced it once, in the context of the water diversion, the northwest channel carrying creek water to the ore processing that happened farther from town. If Sterling decides to move against someone, that's where he'd take them. Far enough from Oakhaven that no one wanders past. His own men on the perimeter. Pierce was quiet for a moment. "I've heard it called the Redoubt. The men who work there don't mix much with the main camp crew. Sterling runs it separately." "How far?" "Half a day's ride north, into the limestone country." Pierce paused. "Why are you thinking about this now?" "Because I want to think about it before I need to," Jesse said. "Not after." Maeve was watching him. Not the way she watched patients. That was clinical, inventorying, looking for specific information. This was different. She was looking at the whole of him, the way you look at something you want to understand fully. He met her eyes and held them for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere either," he said, directly to her. She nodded once, brief and real. Dawn came gray and smoky, the air over Oakhaven still carrying the smell of the burned clinic. Jesse went downstairs at first light and found Julian already there, sitting on a crate near the back door with 2 of his men, talking low. The men rose when Jesse came in. He told them to sit. "How many men does Sterling have at the main operation right now?" Jesse asked Julian. Julian thought for a moment. 12, maybe 15, rotating. Some of them are local men from the valley who took his work. Others came from outside." He paused. "After the flood, he brought in 4 more. Men who didn't come to work the ore. Armed?" "Yes." Jesse stood by the small window that looked out on the alley. The morning was quiet in the way. Mornings are quiet after a bad night, the town still digesting what had happened. He'd seen this before, the day after a fire or a fight or a death, when the community was still processing the new shape of things. He'd also seen what happened when a community finished processing and decided on a direction. It went one of 2 ways. It went quiet and accepting, which was what powerful men like Sterling counted on, the weight of accumulated fear pressing people down into compliance. Or it went the other way. The men in your crew, Jesse said. How many would ride with me into the limestone country if it came to that? Julian looked at him for a long moment, not surprised by the question, more like he'd been waiting for it and was considering the terms carefully, because he was a man who understood that agreeing to something meant something. All of them, Julian said. If the reason was right, the reason would be right, Jesse said. Julian nodded once. The day passed with the specific slowness of days that require waiting. Jesse moved between the hardware store and Walsh's ranch, carrying information both directions, keeping the two places connected. Walsh had heard about the fire and the shooting and had come into town at first light on his own. He stood in Pierce's room for 5 minutes, said almost nothing, and went back to his ranch with the look of a man who had made a private decision he wasn't going to announce until the time came. At the ranch, the roan stood in the corral and watched Jesse cross the yard with an alertness that had changed quality over the weeks. Not the defensive watch of an anxious animal tracking a potential threat. Something more settled. Recognition. Jesse went to the fence, and the roan came to him, all the way to the rail, and stood with his head near Jesse's shoulder. Jesse put his hand on the horse's neck. He was thinking about Pierce, about the sound the old man's voice had made in the burning clinic, steady, purposeful, handing off the satchel before he'd made any move toward his own safety. 15 years of refusing to be run off by Sterling's type, refusing to divide his patients by their worth, refusing to let fear make his professional decisions. And Sterling had answered that with fire and a bullet. Jesse thought about what it meant to watch that happen and do nothing. He thought about the 9 years of doing nothing, of moving on, of keeping his head down and looking out for himself. He thought about all the places he'd been through, where something similar had been happening. A powerful man pressing down on people with fewer resources, the people bending because they had to, and Jesse riding through and telling himself it wasn't his fight. He'd been right that it wasn't his fight technically in every one of those places. He'd been wrong about what that rightness meant, because a man could be technically correct about his obligations and still be choosing something, choosing to let the thing happen, choosing the side that won by default when nobody pushed back. Running away from tyranny wasn't neutrality. It was a vote, cast quietly, for the side doing the running. He'd known this for a long time, somewhere underneath his practical certainty. He'd just never been somewhere long enough, never had enough reason to let himself arrive at it. Fully, he arrived at it now. Standing at the roan's fence in the late morning heat, the horse warm against his hand, Oakhaven visible a mile west, where a thin column of smoke still rose from the clinic's ruins. He was done running. He went back to town. Pierce was sitting up by mid-afternoon, which was either a testament to his constitution or his stubbornness, and Maeve had stopped arguing about it and channeled her energy into making sure he sat up correctly, with the wound supported, and drank the broth that Mrs. Walsh had sent in with her husband. Jesse came in and found Pierce at the desk, not at the bed, at the desk with the annotated survey map spread out and a pen in his hand, adding something to his notes. "You're not supposed to be at the desk," Maeve said from the chair. "I'm being productive," Pierce said. "It's good for recovery. You're going to pull the packing loose. I'm being very still while being productive." Jesse looked at Maeve. She looked at him with an expression that said this had been going on for an hour, and she was handling it through sheer force of reasonable persistence. He pulled up the stool on the other side of the desk. "What are you adding?" he asked Pierce. "Dates," Pierce said. "I've been reconstructing the timeline. When the creek first dropped, when the first patients presented, when the dam was confirmed, when Sterling's men reinforced it." He wrote something in the margin. "If this reaches a territorial court, the timeline is evidence. It shows pattern and intent. Sterling didn't accidentally divert the water. He planned it over months, executed it deliberately, and then defended it with force when it was challenged." He set the pen down and looked at Jesse. "That's not a property dispute. That's a campaign. Will a territorial judge see it that way? Jesse asked. A federal one will, Pierce said, especially with the tribal treaty classification. He paused. That's why Sterling moved when he did. The moment those letters reached Tucson, the matter became federal as much as territorial. He knows that burning the clinic and taking the evidence was his only play. He doesn't have the evidence, Maeve said. She touched the document satchel, which had not moved from its position on the desk. He doesn't know that yet, Jesse said. He thinks he burned the originals, and the case dies without them. He looked at Pierce. How long before that illusion holds? A few days, a week at most. His contacts in the postal offices will tell him the letters went out before the fire. Pierce leaned back carefully. When he knows the copies are already in Tucson, he'll change strategy. He'll go after the witness, Maeve said quietly. The room processed this. Or the person who matters most to the witness, Jesse said. He said it, plainly, because Pierce and Maeve were both people who dealt in plain facts and handled them better than they handled being protected from facts. He watched them both receive it. Pierce's jaw set in the precise, compressed way. Maeve's chin went up slightly, which was her version of the same thing. We need to move the satchel, Jesse said. Not here. Somewhere Sterling's men don't know to look. Walsh, Julian said from the doorway. He'd been on the stairs, apparently, and had heard enough. His ranch house. Sterling hasn't moved against Walsh directly. Not yet, Jesse said. But it's the right place for now. He looked at Julian. Can you get it there tonight without being seen? Yes, Julian said, simply. The satchel went to Walsh's ranch that evening, tucked under the floorboards of the tack room that Walsh opened without a word and closed without a word, which was Walsh's particular way of saying everything necessary. 2 more days passed. On the second day, Tomas came back from the upper trail with information that changed the shape of things. Sterling's reinforcement crew had left the dam site and moved north, toward the limestone country, toward the redoubt, and they'd taken a horse with them that didn't belong to any of them. A sorrel horse, gray at the muzzle, that anyone in Oakhaven would recognize as belonging to the clinic. Jesse stood in the hardware store's back room when Julian told him this and was very still for a moment. The sorrel was Maeve's horse. She'd mentioned it that morning. She'd gone to the stable at dawn to check on it, as she did every day, and found the stall empty. She'd assumed the stable hand had moved it. She hadn't mentioned it to Jesse because there'd been no reason to connect it to anything. Now, there was reason. Sterling knew where the witness was. He knew that the witness mattered to Maeve. He knew that Maeve was the one thing that would change Jesse's calculus faster than anything legal or strategic could. He was setting terms. Jesse went upstairs to Pierce's room. Pierce was at the window, as he'd been increasingly, watching the street with the patience of a man who was doing the one thing available to him, paying attention. Maeve was at the desk, rewriting patient case notes from memory, reconstructing the records lost in the fire because those records represented 3 years of medical care for people who had no other documentation of their own health. Jessie stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. She looked up, read his face the way she read everything directly, without flinching. Tell me, she said. He told her about Tomas's report, about the sorrel, about what it meant. She was quiet for a moment. Her pen was still in her hand. She set it down carefully, parallel to the edge of the paper, a precise small gesture. He wants you to come after me, she said. So he has you away from Oakhaven and away from Pierce. Yes. And if you don't come... He holds the option, Jesse said. Keeps the pressure on. Uses it as a running threat against the legal process. He paused. But I'm going to come after you. She looked at him. Not because I can't help it, he said. Because it's the right move. Because the legal case doesn't need me in Oakhaven. It needs the evidence in Walsh's floor and the letters already in Tucson, and both of those are handled. What it needs is for Sterling to stop being able to threaten the people involved in it. He held her eyes steadily. And the only way to do that is to go get you out of the place he's using you. I'm not there yet, she said. You will be, Pierce said quietly from the window. He'd been listening. He turned to face them both. Sterling's been patient for 8 months. He's not patient anymore. He moved on the clinic because he was running out of time. He'll move again before the week is out. He looked at Maeve. Jesse's right. When he moves, it'll be fast. Maeve looked at Jesse. He looked back. The room was very still. Then we do this right, she said. Not reckless, thought out. Agreed, Jesse said. Julian's crew. Not just me. We go in small and we go in quiet. And we know what we're doing before we go. Julian spoke from the doorway, where he'd apparently become a permanent fixture. I'll get the men. Tonight, Jesse said. We plan tonight. If Sterling moves in the next 2 days, he'll move tomorrow night, Pierce said. The certainty in his voice made both Jesse and Maeve look at him. He was still at the window, looking at the street. Crane's been in town twice today. Both times he left going north. He paused. Sterling's coordinating something. When Crane runs that many errands in one day, something's about to happen. Jesse stood. The tiredness was still there, underneath everything, but above it something sharper and cleaner had taken over. He'd felt this before in the war, in the moments before a mission, when everything simplified down to terrain and timing, and what you knew versus what you didn't. He went to the window beside Pierce and looked at the street. Crane's horse was not visible at the moment. The town looked normal. Evening coming on, the street going quiet, the saloon getting louder as the workday ended. But normal was a surface. Under it, things were moving. Pierce, Jesse said, I need everything you know about the limestone country north of the main operation. Paths, water sources, sightlines. He turned. Julian, I need your best 4 men. Men who can move quiet and follow instructions and make their own decisions when the plan needs adjusting. Because it always needs adjusting. Done, Julian said. Maeve. He said her name, and she looked at him directly. If Sterling moves before we're ready, I can delay them, she said. Whatever comes, I'll find a way to be useful inside it. Not just a problem to be solved. She held his look. I've been doing that my whole life, Jesse. He looked at her for a moment. At the steadiness in her face, built from everything she'd told him, the rented room at 15, the laughter in the mud, 3 years of a clinic that never turned anyone away. The woman who'd chosen the room's use after grief moved out. I know you have, he said. He went downstairs to find Julian and start the plan. The plan was simple, because simple plans survived contact with reality better than complicated ones. Jesse had learned this in the war and relearned it several times after. You planned for what you knew, you left room for what you didn't, and you made sure every person involved understood the goal well enough to reach it by a different route if the first one closed. The goal was Maeve, out of the redoubt, and back to Oakhaven before Sterling's men could regroup. The route was the limestone canyons north of the main operation, which Tomas knew better than anyone because he'd been running that trail for weeks. The timing was before Sterling moved on Maeve, if they could manage it, or immediately after, if they couldn't. The force was Jesse, Julian, and 4 of Julian's best men. 6 people, moving quiet, no unnecessary confrontation. The point was extraction, not battle. You didn't fight your way through if you could think your way through, because thinking left fewer people hurt and more options available at the end. Jesse went over it twice with Julian, and then once more with Tomas, asking questions, adjusting for the terrain details that only someone who'd actually walked the ground could provide. The limestone country was rough, steep draws, loose rock, multiple sight lines that worked both for and against a small group moving through it. There were approaches to the redoute that were exposed and approaches that weren't. Tomas knew the difference. By midnight, the plan was as solid as it was going to get. Jesse went to Pierce's room one last time. Pierce was in the bed now, not the desk, which was either Maeve's victory or exhaustion's, and his color in the lamplight was better than it had been the night before. He was awake. You're going tomorrow, Pierce said. Early. Pierce was quiet for a moment. I'm going to tell you something I told her when she was 17 and had nothing and came to work for me. He looked at the ceiling. I told her that competence and courage are not the same thing, and she needed to develop both, and that the difference between them was this. Competence you could acquire through study and practice. Courage you could only find out you had by doing the thing that required it. He paused. You already have both. Stop carrying them separately. Jessie looked at the old man in the bed, at the careful, stubborn, principled face that had spent a lifetime applying its principles in a place that didn't always welcome them. Rest, Jessie said. You have your own work to do when this is over. The clinic, Pierce said. The clinic, Jessie agreed. He went downstairs, through the back door, out into the alley, where the night air was cool and sharp, and the stars were clear, and the smoke from the ruins was finally gone. He stood for a moment in the dark and thought about what Pierce had said, about carrying things separately, about a man who'd spent 9 years being competent at surviving and never finding out what happened when you added the other thing to it. He was about to find out. The limestone canyons were a day's ride north, and tomorrow they were riding. He went to find his horse. They took Maeve on a Thursday evening, just as Pierce had predicted. 2 of Sterling's men came to the hardware store's back entrance at dusk. Not the front, which told Jessie later that they'd been watching the building long enough to know which door she used when she went for water. She'd gone down alone because she'd done it 20 times, and nothing had happened, and Pierce was sleeping. And she hadn't wanted to wake Jessie, who'd been up since before dawn going over the plan with Julian. By the time Jessie came back from Walsh's ranch an hour later, she was gone, and the water bucket was on its side in the alley. He stood in the alley for exactly as long as it took to confirm what he was looking at. The bucket, the scuff marks in the dirt, the direction the marks went north, toward the canyon road. Then he went inside and woke Pierce and told him simply. And Pierce's face went through several things quickly and arrived at the same place Jessie's had, not panic, because panic used time that needed to go elsewhere, but a hard, forward-facing focus. Go, Pierce said. Jessie went. Julian had the men ready within the hour, because Julian had been ready for 2 days, waiting on the timing. Tomas led them out of Oak Haven on the North Road before full dark, 6 riders moving at a pace that covered ground without burning the horses, and the limestone country came up around them gradually, as the valley fell away behind the terrain, changing from red sandstone flats to pale gray rock, angular and layered, the draws narrowing, the canyon walls rising again in a different register from Sunstone Canyon, less red and more bone-white under the rising moon. They rode through the night. Maeve had not been passive in the alley. That was established afterward. From 2 sources, one of Sterling's men had a bruised forearm that hadn't come from the ride, and Tomas found a strip of blue cloth, Maeve's blue cloth, tied to a branch at the first trail junction north of town, 6 inches of fabric on a branch that a person who was paying attention would place deliberately, and a person in a hurry would walk past without seeing. She was marking the route. Jessie saw the second marker at the limestone country's entrance, another strip, smaller, on a rock at a trail fork, and the third one 2 miles past that, which told him she was alive and thinking and finding ways to communicate across the distance between them. He collected each piece of cloth. He didn't say anything about it. He just put them in his coat pocket and kept riding. The redoute sat in a natural bowl in the limestone country, a 1/4 mile off the main trail, accessible by a single approach road and surrounded on 3 sides by the steep-walled draws that made the terrain useful for Sterling's purposes, defensible, private, removed from any casual observation. The ore processing equipment was visible from the high ground above the bowl, 2 large sluice frames, a stamp mill, a water tank fed by the diverted Sunstone Creek Channel. 3 buildings, one larger than the others, built from the same rough timber and corrugated iron that characterized Sterling's infrastructure, everywhere functional without being permanent, the construction of a man who didn't plan to answer for what he built there. Tomas had scouted it twice. He knew the guard rotation. 2 men on the approach road, one at the large building's door, one moving a circuit around the camp perimeter. 4 guards, on a normal shift. Sterling had added 2 more after the flood. Jesse lay on the limestone rim above the bowl, with Julian beside him, and counted 6 guards in the late afternoon light, the long amber light of 4 o'clock, that threw everything into sharp relief, and made estimation easy if you were patient enough to wait and watch. 2 extra at the building, Julian said quietly. He's expecting us, Jesse said. Then why only 6? Jesse looked at the camp. The processing equipment was idle. No ore work happening, no noise from the stamp mill. The guards were moving, but not urgently. 2 of them were by the fire pit outside the large building, talking. The relaxed posture of men on a shift that wasn't interesting. Because 6 is enough if the approach road is the only way in. Julian looked at the rim they were lying on. Is it? No, Jesse said. But 6 is also not enough if the people coming in know about the other ways. Tomas, 3 feet to Jesse's right, pointed without speaking. A shallow draw on the bowl's east side, barely visible, choked with scrub brush that had found the moisture running along the limestone. Crack. It ran from the rim down to the camp's backside to a position behind the large building that the guard circuit didn't pass directly. Drainage draw, Tomas said. I've been through it on foot, tight but passable. Jesse studied the guard circuit. The man walking the perimeter covered the east side of the camp every 12 minutes. After he passed, there was a gap. The guard moved to the north side, then west, and didn't return to the east for the full circuit length. 12 minutes was enough. We go at twilight, Jesse said. Not full dark, the moon's not up until later, and the draw will be blind without light. We need enough sky to move through without noise. He looked at Julian. You and 2 men, take the approach road, not to attack, to be visible. Make enough noise that the guards on the road think they have a problem there. The other 2 men and I go down the draw while they're looking at you. Julian considered this. The men on the road will be armed. You'll be armed too. But this isn't about shooting anyone if we can avoid it. It's about eyes pointing the wrong direction for long enough. He looked at Julian steadily. You understand the difference between creating a distraction and starting a fight? I've been managing that difference for 4 years working for Sterling's operation, Julian said, with a specific edge. I know how to make noise without giving anyone a reason to shoot first. Jesse nodded. That was enough. Inside the large building, Maeve had spent 22 hours making herself as useful as she could stand to be. This had been a conscious decision, made in the alley, when the second man's hand closed on her arm, and she understood that shouting or running wasn't going to produce anything but injury. She'd made the calculation fast. She was good at fast calculations, had been since she was 15, and arrived at the following. If she was going to be inside Sterling's remote operation for any length of time, the most effective position was not as a problem, but as a resource. Because a resource had leverage that a problem didn't. There was a man at the redoubt with an infected hand. She'd noticed it in the first hour, when the guard brought her water, and she saw the way he held the cup, favoring his left hand, his right hand wrapped in a cloth that was 2 days old and darkening at the edges. She didn't say anything immediately. She waited until he came back with food. Your hand, she said. He looked at her. I'm a medical assistant from Dr. Pierce's clinic in Oakhaven, she said. I can see your hand is infected. If I had clean cloth and hot water and something for the inflammation, I could help you. The man, his name was Decker, she learned eventually. A big, quiet man from somewhere in Texas, who'd been with Sterling's operation for a year and had the look of someone who'd made a succession of decisions he wasn't entirely at peace with. Looked at his hand and then at her. He'd been told she was a hostage. Nobody had told him she was a doctor, or what to do with that. He got her the hot water. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, the way Pierce had taught her, not the gentle way, the effective way, which involved some discomfort but produced results. She told Decker what she was doing, and why as she worked, Not because he asked, but because she'd learned that people submitted to painful necessary treatment far more readily when they understood its purpose. The infection has been in there at least 4 days, she said. You can see the red tracking here. That's the body trying to wall it off. If it had gone another few days without cleaning, you'd be looking at losing the use of the hand. Decker looked at his hand with an expression of someone who hadn't known this and found it significant. I kept thinking it would clear up on its own. Some things clear up on their own, Maeve said. Infected puncture wounds generally don't. The wound closes at the surface while the problem deepens underneath. She was applying the drawing salve she'd taken from her satchel, her medical satchel, which they'd let her keep because nobody had thought through why she might have one. This will pull the bad matter out over the next day. Keep it covered with clean cloth. Change the cloth morning and evening. She redressed the wound and told him about carbolic solution and where to get it and why it worked. And by the end of the conversation, Decker was looking at her with a careful, recalibrated attention that said his understanding of the situation had developed. 2 other guards had come to watch by the time she finished. She ignored them and cleaned up after herself with the methodical efficiency that Pierce had made habitual. And she thought about the draw on the east side of the camp that she'd seen from the window when they'd brought her in. She'd been looking for it, because Jesse would look for it too. The guard rotation changed twice while she waited. She paid attention to the timing. 12 minutes between passes on the east side. She'd done the rough calculation when she first came in, and she'd been refining it since. She also talked to the guards, not incessantly, not in a way that was obviously purposeful. But Maeve Holloway had grown up alone and learned early that people talked, if you gave them the right kind of space, and that listening, genuine listening, not the performance of it, made people say things they hadn't entirely planned to say. Decker talked about Texas, about a family in San Antonio he sent money to, about the fact that he'd taken Sterling's work because the pay was better than ranch work, and that had seemed like the main consideration at the time. Was it? Maeve asked. Decker looked at his bandaged hand. Different considerations seem more important now, he said. Considerations change when you understand the full picture, she said, not pushing, just noting. He was quiet for a while. Then, what did Sterling do exactly? To the town, she told him, calmly in order, with the facts laid out the way Pierce arranged an argument chronologically, specifically, without embellishment, because the facts were already bad enough without embellishment. The water diversion, the stagnant pools, the sick families, Mendez on his cot, the flood that had happened because Sterling's auxiliary dam was built to redirect rather than hold, the clinic fire, Pierce's bullet wound. She watched Decker's face during this. The man who got shot, she said. Dr. Pierce, he's 61 years old. He's been treating people in that valley for 15 years. He's never turned away a patient for lack of money. She looked at Decker directly. That's the man your employer shot. The room was quiet. I didn't do the shooting, Decker said. No, she agreed. But you're here. And the people who did it are working for the same operation you are. She paused. That's a thing a person has to decide what to do with. She didn't push past that. She didn't need to. The information was available, and Decker was a man with enough moral residue to feel its weight, and the feeling would do its own work without her pressing. Twilight arrived orange through the building's single window. She was ready. She'd been ready since midday, when she'd quietly moved her satchel to the position nearest the back wall, which was nearest the east side of the camp, which was nearest the drainage draw. She'd also eaten everything they'd brought her, which was not because she was hungry, but because she might need to run, and running on an empty stomach was worse than running on a full one. These were practical considerations. She was a practical woman. The disturbance at the approach road started about 15 minutes before she'd estimated, which meant Jesse was early, which meant he'd been watching longer than she'd calculated. She adjusted. The sounds from the road voices. Hoofbeats, a challenge from the road guards, drew the attention of the two men outside the building's door. She could hear their feet shift on the rocky ground as they moved toward the camp's south side to see what was happening. Decker was still inside. He was at the far end of the room, not far from the door, and he turned at the sounds from the road with his hand on his sidearm. "What's that?" he said. "Someone on the road," Maeve said. She was standing. She'd been on her feet for 3 minutes, casually, moving around the room in a way that put her progressively closer to the back wall. Decker moved toward the door. The back wall had a gap between two of the timber planks, low, near the ground, not a window, not an exit, but a gap wide enough to see through. She'd been watching the east draw through it since mid-afternoon. She put her eye to it now. A shape was moving in the draw. Low fast, using the brush for cover, coming down through the limestone in the specific careful way of a man who'd moved through difficult terrain under pressure before and knew to lead with attention rather than speed. Jesse. Two other shapes behind him. She was at the back wall when the gap in the plank suddenly widened, someone's hands on the outside, pulling the timber groaning. Jesse's voice came through the gap, low and controlled. "Maeve." "Here," she said. The plank came free. Then another. Jesse came through the gap in a controlled motion, got upright, and looked at her. She was standing with her satchel over her shoulder, and she was uninjured, and his face registered both these facts in a single rapid pass. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She turned. Decker was at the front of the room, still facing the door, and he'd heard the sounds from the back wall, but hadn't turned yet, which told her his processing was a second behind. She said quickly, but not urgently, "Decker, the people coming through the back wall are not going to hurt you if you don't give them a reason." Decker turned. He looked at Jesse, who had stepped fully into the room, and at the two of Julian's men coming through behind Jesse, and at Maeve, who was standing between them all, with her satchel over her shoulder, and an expression that was alert but not afraid. His hand was still near his sidearm. "Not on it. Near it." "Decker," Maeve said. "You know what Sterling did. You know why I'm here. These men are from Oakhaven." She held his eyes. "What you do right now is your own decision. I want you to make it with the full picture." The room was very quiet. The sounds from the approach road were getting louder, Julian doing his work, creating enough noise and movement to hold the road guard's attention. Jesse stayed still. The two men behind him stayed still. Nobody reached for anything. Decker's hand moved away from the sidearm, slowly and with intention, not surrendering, making a choice. He turned back toward the door and looked at it and said, "To nobody in particular, I need to go think about my situation." He went out the front. Jesse looked at Maeve. She looked at Jesse. A full second passed. "Let's go," she said. They went through the back wall gap, the same way Jesse had come in. Maeve went first, then Jesse, then the two men from Julian's crew. The drainage draw was tighter going up than coming down, the limestone scrub grabbing at sleeves and shoulders, the footing loose in places, but she was up the draw and over the rim in under 6 minutes because she was moving with the focus of a woman who had been ready to move for 22 hours. Jesse was right behind her. At the rim, in the last of the twilight, they stopped and caught breath, and she turned and looked at him fully, for the first time since the alley in Oakhaven. He was cut across the forearm from the limestone, a scrape, nothing serious, and had dust on his face, and the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy and was only now beginning to set it down. She took his face in both her hands. Briefly, "The way you hold something you need to confirm is real, before you trust the rest of your senses about it." Then she dropped her hands, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood, for one moment on the limestone rim, with the dark country spreading out around them. "Decker," he said. Not a question. He needed someone to be honest with him, she said. "Most people are trying to figure out the right thing to do. They just need the full picture to do it from." Jesse looked at the rim. Down below in the bowl, the noise from the approach road was beginning to resolve Julian. extracting himself from the confrontation with the practiced skill of a man who knew how to make an exit. You were working him all day. I was treating his infected hand, she said, and talking to him honestly. Those are two different things that happen to be useful at the same time. Jesse looked at her in the last light. Are you really not hurt? I'm tired, and I'm hungry, and I want to see Pierce, she said, but no. He nodded. He kept his arm where it was, and she let it stay, and they moved away from the rim toward the horses. The limestone country, pale and enormous around them, the stars beginning above. Julian met them at the trail junction. His face, when he saw Maeve, carried the same compression and release that Jesse recognized in himself, the managed tension of the last 24 hours finding its resolution. He nodded to her once, and she nodded back, and they didn't say anything else about it because it was already understood. They rode south through the limestone country as the moon came up, the pale rock turning silver around them, the trail clear in the moonlight, Tomas in front, knowing every turn. Nobody talked much. The silence was the good kind, tired and earned, the silence of a group of people who'd done a difficult thing successfully and were still close enough to it that speech seemed beside the point. Maeve rode beside Jesse. At some point, around midnight, with Oakhaven's lights beginning to appear in the valley below, she said, he's going to know tonight didn't go the way he planned. Yes, Jesse said. What happens next? It wasn't quite a question. She was thinking ahead, the way she always did, organized, and looking past the immediate present toward what it required. Next is the law, Jesse said. Pierce's letters are in Tucson. The evidence is in Walsh's floor. The witness is right here. He looked at her. Sterling's out of plays that work in the dark. He's going to have to try playing in the light, and the light is not his best environment. She was quiet for a moment. The valley came up around them as they descended from the limestone country, the air warming, the smell of dust and sage replacing the cold mineral smell of the high rock. The clinic, she said, will be rebuilt, Jesse said. Walsh has already said so. Julian's crew has already said so. He paused. Half the valley said so the morning after the fire. You should have heard them. She looked at him. You've been here 3 years, he said. Pierce has been here 15. You don't have to burn down what people value for them to know they value it. Sometimes it just takes the burning. He held her gaze. People know what they have in you and in Pierce. She looked at the valley below, at the lights of Oakhaven, coming into view. She looked at them for a long time, this small collection of lights in a very large, dark landscape. And whatever she was thinking moved across her face in a way he didn't try to read specifically, because some things were private, even between two people who were becoming less and less private with each other. Thank you, she said, for coming. There was no version of things where I didn't come, he said. She looked at him, steady and direct, those warm sandstone eyes finding their way through the dark. I know, she said. That's what I'm thanking you for. They rode into Oakhaven just past 1 in the morning. The hardware store's upper window had its light on. Pierce was awake, because of course he was, probably doing the case notes in his head, since he couldn't do them on paper without Maeve's assistance, with his arm. She went straight upstairs. Jesse stood in the back alley with the horses and listened to the sound of her voice through the upstairs window. Not the words, just the sound, steady and present, beginning its account of the last 22 hours for Pierce's careful attention. Julian dismounted beside him and stood looking up at the light. What now? Julian asked. Not anxious. Just asking now. Sterling knows we know, Jesse said, and the marshal knows we know. And pretty soon, those two things are going to be in a room together, and Sterling's going to have to stand between them. He looked at the dark street. That's the fight we actually win. Julian nodded. He began leading the horses toward the stable, unhurried, and the night settled around the town, and from somewhere to the north, the limestone country rose pale and still under the moon, and the Sunstone Creek ran through the dark valley, and the whole of the summer's work sat waiting for what came next. Jesse stood in the alley a moment longer. Then he went inside. The federal marshal's name was Colton Briggs, and he arrived in Oak Haven on a Tuesday morning, 12 days after the clinic fire, riding a government-issue gray and trailing two deputies who looked young enough that Maeve suspected they'd been assigned to Briggs specifically because he was the kind of man who could keep inexperienced deputies from getting hurt. Briggs himself was not young. He was 50-something, weathered, in the way that men who'd spent decades in territorial service were weathered by sun and bad food and the specific kind of patience required to do legal work in places where the law was new and hadn't yet convinced everyone of its authority. He had a careful, unhurried quality, the quality of a man who'd learned that moving too fast in complex situations produced outcomes that required considerable effort to undo. He went first to the ruins of the clinic. Jesse watched from across the street as Briggs walked the perimeter of the burned adobe walls, stopping at intervals, crouching once to examine something in the ash. He stayed there for 20 minutes. Then he came to the hardware store. Pierce received him in his rooms, sitting up at his desk, because Pierce at a desk was a different thing than Pierce in a bed, and they all understood this, including Briggs, who adjusted his approach accordingly. The marshal was there for 2 hours. He read the attorney's letter from Tucson. He studied the annotated survey map. He reviewed the timeline Pierce had reconstructed. He read Jesse's affidavit twice, slowly, and then asked Jesse 3 clarifying questions in the flat. Specific manner of someone building a case rather than gathering impressions. Jesse answered each question exactly as asked, no more. Briggs looked at him when he finished. You'd testify to this in a federal proceeding. I testified in 2 courts-martial during the war, Jesse said. I said what I'd seen. Same principle. Briggs looked back at the affidavit. The dam is still in place? Reinforced, Jesse said. Sterling's men worked on it 2 weeks ago. I'll need to see it. I'll ride up with you. Briggs looked at Pierce. The shooting. Do you have a description of the shooter? I did not see the shooter, Pierce said. I was coming through the burning doorway when I was hit. He paused. However, I have a list of the men known to be working for Sterling's operation in Oak Haven that evening, compiled by Mr. Julian Ruiz, who is available to speak with you. Briggs folded the affidavit. I'll need to speak with Sterling. He's at the main operation north of town, Jesse said. He's been there since the night of the fire. Something moved through Briggs's eyes. Brief and specific. Has he? He hasn't left the valley, Jesse said. Julian's men have been watching the roads. Briggs looked at Jesse for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite its absence. Unofficially, he said. Entirely, Jesse agreed. Briggs rode out to the dam site that afternoon with Jesse and one of his deputies. He stood where Jesse had stood the first time, looking at the structure, at the diversion channel, at the dry creek bed below it. He measured the buffer zone with a surveyor's chain his deputy carried. He wrote in a small leather notebook. He was there for 40 minutes and left with the notebook closed and, his face in a neutral configuration, that said he'd gotten what he came for. That evening, Briggs went to Sterling's operation. Jesse didn't go with him. That wasn't his place, and he knew it. He went instead to Walsh's ranch and took the roan out for the first real ride out of the corral, out of the ranch yard, onto the open valley road, and the horse moved under him with a willingness that was the sum of 6 weeks of careful, patient work and was, in its own way, complete. He rode the valley in the late light and thought about what came next, which was mostly waiting, which was mostly something he was good at and did not enjoy. The waiting lasted 4 more days. In that time, Briggs interviewed Julian, Walsh, 3 of Julian's crew, 2 homesteaders from the lower valley, whose wells had been affected, Mrs. Garza, who was fully recovered and had opinions about the matter that she expressed with considerable force, and Decker, who had returned to Oak Haven on his own 2 days after the Redoubt extraction, and presented himself to Briggs voluntarily, his bandaged hand held at his side, his face carrying the resolution of a man who'd made a decision and was going to stay with it. Maeve heard about this from Jesse, who heard it from Julian. She went to find Decker at the hotel where he'd taken a room. He was in the lobby, hat on his knee, looking like a man waiting for a verdict on something. She sat down across from him. "How's the hand?" He looked at it. The new dressing she'd described to him, he'd found it somewhere. Clean cloth and the right salve. Was holding correctly. "Better," he said. "You were right about the tracking. It's gone." "Good." She looked at him. "You came back, had to?" he said simply. "Once I had the full picture." He paused. The doctor. "Pierce, how is he?" "Recovering." She held his look. "He'll be back at work in 2 weeks. Maybe less, knowing him." Decker nodded slowly. "I didn't know about the shooting before it happened," he said. "I want that on record. I was at the camp that night." "I know," she said. "I told Marshal Briggs." He looked at her for a moment. "You told him that?" "You treated me decently at the redoubt," she said. "I don't see a reason to be imprecise about what I know and don't know." He sat with that for a moment. Outside the hotel's front window, Oak Haven's Main Street went about its afternoon business, and the canyon beyond the valley was orange in the late light. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Don't know yet," he said. "Something that doesn't require looking the other way." He said this plainly, without drama, as a man states a revised position on something he's thought through. "Turns out that has a cost I didn't account for initially." "Most worthwhile changes do," Maeve said. She left him to his waiting and went back to the hardware store, where Pierce was at his desk and making the recovery faster than his body strictly endorsed, and where Jesse would come by after dark the way he'd been coming by every evening since the redoubt, and where the work of rebuilding what had been burned was already, incrementally, underway. Sterling moved on Friday, not the direction anyone expected. He sent Crane to Briggs with a written offer, a settlement proposal, his attorney's language all over it, structured to acknowledge nothing and concede everything practical while preserving Sterling's legal standing for any future claims. The dam would be removed. The water rights would revert to public classification. A sum of money significant specified would go to the affected families in the South Camp. Sterling would withdraw from the Oak Haven Valley entirely within 60 days. In exchange, the federal investigation would close. No charges filed. Briggs read the proposal and came to Pierce. Pierce read it and called Jesse and Maeve and Julian. They sat in Pierce's room, the 5 of them, Pierce at his desk, Maeve in the chair, Jesse on the stool, Julian in the doorway that had become his customary position, Briggs standing, and nobody said anything for a moment after Pierce finished reading it aloud. "He's running," Julian said. "He's buying his exit," Jesse said. "There's a difference." He looked at Briggs. "What happens to the shooting? To the fire?" "The settlement proposal doesn't address those specifically," Briggs said, "which is an omission his attorney will claim was inadvertent and which I will claim was deliberate." He paused. "Arson and attempted murder are criminal matters. A civil settlement doesn't close them." "Will you pursue them?" Maeve asked. Briggs looked at her steadily. "Yes, but pursuing them and successfully prosecuting them are different outcomes in a territory where my office has limited resources, and Sterling has considerable legal support." He said this with the flat honesty of a man who'd made many promises over his career and had learned to be careful about the difference between what he could promise and what he could do. The civil settlement gives the valley what it needs: the water, the land, the families protected. The criminal case is harder and slower, and I won't tell you otherwise. The room absorbed this. "Take the settlement," Maeve said. She said it quietly, but without hesitation, and everyone in the room looked at her. "The dam comes down. The water comes back. The families in the South Camp get real money, enough to make a real difference. That's what Pierce's letters were for. That's the point." She looked at Pierce. "Isn't it?" Pierce looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "That was always the point. We wanted justice," Julian said. "Not arguing, clarifying. We wanted the water back and the people safe," Maeve said. "Justice that produces those things is justice." The rest as she paused, finding the right word, satisfying but separate. Julian looked at the window. At the valley beyond it, he was quiet for a while. The families, he said. They'll have a say. The settlement specifies payment to affected households directly, Briggs said. Not to the company, not to the territory. To the people. He paused. I made sure of that wording. Julian looked at Jesse. Jesse looked back. Between the two of them in that look, something was confirmed that had been building since the first night Jesse had ridden into the South Camp with Maeve. Take it, Julian said. They took it. Briggs sent his response to Sterling's attorney. Friday evening. The agreement would be formalized in Prescott within the week, before a territorial judge who had been briefed by the Federal Land Commissioner's office. Sterling would not be in Oakhaven to sign it. He'd send his attorney. Because by the time Friday's response was sent, Sterling was already making arrangements to leave. Jesse found out about the leaving from Walsh, who heard it from the livery owner, who'd been asked to prepare a heavy coach for a long journey north. Gold-laden, that was the liveryman's word, though he'd phrased it more carefully, said. The coach sat heavy on its springs before anything was loaded into it. Sterling was taking what he could carry and going, while the going was arranged in his favor. Jesse told Maeve that evening. They were at the creek bank below town, where they'd taken to walking in the evenings, now that the evenings were safe again. The creek running full and clean, after the summer rains had settled and the dam was 3 days from coming down. He's leaving tonight? She said. Early morning, most likely. North Road. He'll take the canyon route and connect to the main trail in Flagstaff. Jesse looked at the creek. He'll make it look like a business departure. Orderly. No running. Maeve was quiet for a moment. But it's running. Yes. She looked at the water moving past. The creek was back to something close to its natural volume. The blockage already beginning to give, as Sterling's operation wound down its water use. In a few days, it would be full. In a week, the lower pools would flush, and the South Camp would have the water it hadn't had all summer. He'll have the gold, she said. Some of it, Jesse said. The settlement takes a piece. Briggs's criminal investigation, even if it doesn't reach conviction, puts a lien on what's left. He paused. He won't leave rich. He'll leave liquid. She understood the distinction. Rich was what you built over time. Liquid was what you took with you when the building was done. She looked at Jesse. We should let him go, she said. We should, he agreed. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the canyon road north, the direction a heavy coach would go tomorrow morning. She read his face. Knew it well enough by now to know the difference between the calculation that was finished and the one still running. Jesse, there's something I want to do first, he said. She waited. Not to stop him, he said. Not to hurt him. He turned to look at her, just to make sure he leaves understanding what happened here, what it cost. He paused. And to do it the right way. She held his look for a moment. Then she said, I'm coming with you. He started to say something. I know the mud flats, she said. You don't. Not the way I do. He closed his mouth. Looked at the creek. Looked at her. You know where Sterling's coach will cross? Sunstone Creek crosses the North Road 2 miles up the canyon, she said. At low summer water, there's a ford. Hard-packed gravel. Wagons use it all the time. She paused. After 2 weeks of rain and the backed-up water releasing from the dam site, that ford is going to be silt. It runs volatile this time of year, looks solid on the surface, gives way under weight. The creek spreads there, drops its load, builds up in layers. Jesse was very still. How volatile? Axle deep for a heavy coach, she said. If it goes in right. He looked at her for a long time. Reading something. She let him read it. You've crossed it wrong before, he said. 3 times, she said. Never made the same mistake twice. She looked at the canyon road, but I know exactly where the mistake is. They rode out before dawn, the 2 of them, following the North Canyon Road by starlight, and the particular gray-purple of 4 in the morning that let you see shapes without colors. They reached the ford site in 40 minutes, and she showed him what she meant. The creek spread here to 40 feet across, shallow and deceptively still. the surface a flat, dark mirror. But the silt below it was the layered, saturated kind that formed at the inside bend of every creek in this country when the water slowed enough to drop what it was carrying, and after weeks of backed-up water releasing, the layers were deep and fresh and would not support a loaded coach. The road approached the ford from the south at an angle. A coach driver who knew the ford would angle right toward the upstream bank where the water moved faster and the bottom was firmer. A driver who didn't know, or who was told incorrectly, would take the direct line, which put the right wheels in the soft center of the spread. They arranged themselves on the upstream bank, in the shadow of the canyon wall, and waited. Sterling's coach came up the north road at just past 7 in the morning, which was earlier than Jessie had expected, and exactly when Maeve had said. She knew this valley's rhythms, the way she knew everything she'd paid attention to for 3 years, down to the habits of men who thought nobody was watching. It was a fine coach, heavy, well-built, the springs doing their work under a substantial load. 2 men on the box, a driver and a guard. 2 outriders. Crane was not with them, which meant Crane was handling the Prescott formalities, which meant Sterling had divided his departures deliberately. Sterling himself was visible through the coach window as it came down the approach to the ford. Gray-haired, straight-backed, the composed posture of a man managing an exit on his own terms. The driver took the direct line. The right wheels went into the soft center of the ford, and for a moment nothing happened, just the coach moving through shallow water, and then the silt took hold the way silt does gradually, then completely, and the coach slowed and sank and stopped with its wheels axle deep in the gray-brown muck of Sunstone Creek, and the horses lunged and found no purchase and stilled, and the whole thing sat there with the particular immovable quality of something that has found the exact wrong place and settled into it. The outriders wheeled their horses and pulled up at the bank, reading the situation. One of them went for the coach door. Sterling came out himself before the man reached it, stepping down into ankle-deep water with an expression that was managing itself very carefully, and looked at the ford, and looked at the wheels, and looked at the canyon walls around him. His eyes found Jessie on the upstream bank. The recognition was immediate. Then he found Maeve, and his expression did something more complex. Jessie uncoiled the rope from his saddle horn, the same braided hemp he'd carried for 6 weeks, worn soft with use, the rope he'd used in the Sunstone mud the afternoon. This all began, he threw it across the water with an easy underhand toss that landed it at Sterling's feet. Sterling looked at the rope. "Tie it off to the coach frame," Jessie said. "We'll pull you to the bank." Sterling looked at him for a long moment, at the rope, at Maeve, at the canyon walls and the creek and the mud, holding his coach and his gold in place, with the complete indifference of geography. He picked up the rope. He tied it off himself, methodically, without asking for help, which Jessie noted and respected on the level of pure practicality. Sterling knew a knot when he needed one. He waded to the bank and stood on solid ground with creek water to his knees, and looked at Jessie with the careful, controlled eyes of a man who understood he had arrived at a reckoning and was going to hold himself together for it. Jessie tied his end to the buckskin saddle horn and nudged the horse forward. The rope went taut. The coach groaned and shifted, and the mare pulled with the steady, patient strength that good horses produce when asked correctly, and the coach came free of the silt with the long sucking sound Maeve knew well, and rolled to the firmer bank. Sterling stood on the bank with mud to his knees and looked at Jessie. Jessie looked back. "They're pulling you out," Jessie said, not out of mercy, but because justice requires you to stand on your own 2 feet before a judge. The canyon was quiet around them. The creek moved past, full and indifferent, carrying the summer's accumulation toward the valley below, toward the South Camp, and the homesteads, and the people who'd been waiting for it since July. Sterling looked at him for a long moment. There was no performance in his face. Whatever mask the man wore in his own operation, Stripped of his men and his resources, and his carefully managed exits, what remained was just a man standing in wet boots on a creek bank, looking at the shape of what he'd done and what it had produced. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Briggs materialized from the canyon road, behind Sterling's coach. He'd been 100 yards back, following at a distance that was officially coincidental, which everyone understood was nothing of the kind. He came up on his gray horse and looked at the coach and the creek and Sterling, and his face was the careful neutral of a man who was not going to show satisfaction in a professional context. "Mr. Sterling," Briggs said, "I have some additional questions for you before you leave the territory. I'd appreciate your time." Sterling looked at Briggs, then at Jesse, then at Maeve, who was on her horse at the upstream bank and had said nothing throughout, who had simply been there, knowing the ford and knowing the mud and knowing exactly where the wrong line was. Sterling nodded once and went with Briggs. Jesse rode to Maeve's side. They watched Sterling's coach, freed from the mud, turn on the canyon road and head back toward Oakhaven at Briggs' direction. The outriders followed. The canyon went quiet again, just the creek and the canyon walls and the two of them on horseback in the morning light. "He understood," Maeve said. "Yes, that's enough." She said it without sentiment, just as a true thing. Sometimes understanding is what justice looks like. Not always a courtroom. Jesse looked at the mud, already resettling, already forgetting the coach had been there. Already forgetting about any of it. The creek didn't care about it ran. Carrying what it carried, going where it was going. "Let's go home," he said. She looked at him when he said it, at the word. He met her look and held it, and neither of them said anything else about it, because nothing else needed saying. They turned south and rode back down the canyon toward Oakhaven, and the morning opened up around them, wide and red and clear. The dam came down on a Wednesday. Briggs's deputies supervised the removal, which took 6 men most of a morning, pulling the sluice gate first, letting the impounded water begin its return, then dismantling the timber and stone structure piece by piece until Sunstone Creek ran through the canyon head, the way it had run for 1,000 years before anyone thought to interrupt it. Julian's crew did the physical work. Julian had offered. Briggs had accepted. There was something appropriate about that, which everyone understood and nobody said out loud, because some things communicate more clearly without being named. Jesse rode up with Walsh to watch. Not the whole process, they had work of their own. Walsh's horses needing attention, the roan now fully working and ready for the kind of evaluation that would establish his value and his future. They stayed long enough to see the water find its old course below the dam site, the creek bed waking up, the dark line of moisture spreading down through the dry channel ahead of the actual flow, the ground remembering. Walsh stood by his horse and watched the water come back into its bed, and his silence was the deep kind, the kind that comes from watching something restored that was close to being lost permanently. 12 years I've used this creek," Walsh said. Jesse nodded. "Didn't appreciate it the way I should have," Walsh said, "until it was mostly gone." "Most things work that way," Jesse said. Walsh looked at him with a brief, dry expression. "Philosophy before noon. You've been spending too much time at the clinic." "The clinic's being rebuilt," Jesse said. "Less time there, more time here soon." "Good," Walsh said. "The roan needs real work now, not that careful creekside business." He started toward his horse. "I need someone who can push him without breaking what you built." Jesse fell in beside him. "That's what I'm here for." Walsh mounted, looked down at Jesse. "How long are you here for?" Jesse looked at the creek running clear and fast below the former dam site, carrying the summer's accumulated water toward the valley. He thought about the letter from New Mexico that he'd never answered and had stopped thinking about answering. He thought about a modest land tract adjacent to the creek that he'd looked at twice now, both times telling himself he was looking out of general interest, both times knowing that was only partly true. "I'm looking at a parcel east of the valley," Jesse said. "Creek access. Good grass." Size enough for a small operation. Walsh said nothing for a moment then. Peterson's old parcel. You know it? Good land, Walsh said, simply. He turned his horse south. Hurry up. The roan's waiting. The settlement money reached the South Camp families before the end of August. Briggs handled the distribution personally, which told Jesse something about the marshal's understanding of what impersonal distribution did to people who'd spent months being treated as units of labor rather than humans with standing. Each household received their portion directly. Julian sat with Briggs during the process, translating where needed, ensuring the amounts were right, which they were. Afterward, Julian found Jesse at Walsh's corral, and they stood at the fence in the late afternoon and watched the roan work through his paces. Families are going to stay, Julian said. Most of them. The money helps. But it's also, he paused, finding the right word. It's also that someone came. That the law came and said the thing done to them was wrong, and here's something real to show it. He watched the horse. People need that. The acknowledgement as much as the remedy. Pierce says the same thing about medicine, Jesse said. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is name what's happening accurately, even when you can't fix everything. Julian looked at him. Pierce is a wise man. He is. Don't tell him I said so. He'll put it in his case notes. Julian smiled. It was a real smile, which on Julian's face was the rarer kind, and therefore more valuable. He watched the roan move through another circuit. He looks like a different horse. He is a different horse. Jesse watched the animal, the loose, forward movement, the willingness, the ears forward rather than back. He was always this horse. He just didn't know it yet. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then what you said to me back at the beginning. When I asked if you'd ride with us into the limestone country, he paused. You said the reason would be right. It was, Jesse said. Yes. Julian looked at the valley, at the canyon beyond it, at the mountains north where the water came from. I've been thinking about what makes a reason right. How you know? Jesse looked at him. I think it's when the thing you're doing is for people who can't do it themselves in that moment, Julian said. Not because they're weak. Because there's something, a law, a gun, a man with money that puts it past their reach just then. He turned back to the corral. When you step into that space, the reason is right. Jesse thought about this for a while. That's better than how I would have said it. You already knew it, Julian said. You just hadn't said it. Pierce was back at his desk by the first week of September, which was exactly 2 weeks earlier than Maeve had told him he could be, and was the outcome of a negotiation that had ended with her exacting the concession that he would sit at the desk rather than stand, take lunch without argument, and let her redress the wound every morning. Pierce agreed to these terms, and immediately began violating the standing provision, which Maeve addressed by removing the standing option, which she did by taking the lamp off the tall shelf where it required standing to reach, and putting it on the desk where it didn't. Pierce looked at the lamp on his desk. I was going to put that back, he said. I know, she said, and went to the dispensary. The clinic was being rebuilt around them. Walsh's men had started the frame the week after the fire. Using the original adobe walls where they'd held most of them, the structure was sound and building the roof from better material, fire-resistant clay tile rather than the original dry timber. It was going to be a better building than the one that burned, which Pierce noted without satisfaction, because the improvement shouldn't have required a fire. The community had appeared in the first week with lumber and labor and food, and, in several cases, money, which Pierce accepted with the same equanimity he applied to everything, neither overwhelmed nor distant, just present and grateful, and already thinking about where the new dispensary shelves should go. Maeve rebuilt her herb stores from scratch, which took most of August, and required 3 trips into the canyon to harvest, 2 orders from a supplier in Tucson, and the donation of a significant quantity of dried chamomile from Mrs. Walsh, who grew it in a window box and had apparently been growing it for years in quantities that suggested she'd anticipated a need. She reorganized the dispensary differently than before. Better, she thought. The experience of losing everything and rebuilding from memory clarified what was essential and what was habit, and the new arrangement reflected what she'd learned rather than what she'd inherited. Pierce watched this process with the approval he expressed through not commenting on it, which was his highest form. Jesse came by the clinic most evenings, officially to check on the construction progress, which was a reason that satisfied nobody but was also not challenged because the real reason was visible, and nobody saw a point in covering it over with a better official story. He and Maeve walked the creek in the evenings, as they'd been doing. The creek was back to its full summer volume now, the released water having found its old courses and the natural flow reestablished from the dam's removal. The lower pools were clear. The South Camp's water was clean. The willowbark stand that Maeve had been harvesting when she fell in the mud, the stand she'd been trying to reach 6 weeks ago, that had started everything, was fully in the water again, the plants upright and green and thriving. She showed it to Jesse one evening in the last week of August, pointing from the bank. "That's the stand," she said. "That's what I was going for." He looked at it. "Looks exactly like a plant to me. It's willow bark. It's been used medicinally for thousands of years. The Romans used it. Hippocrates wrote about it. Salicin, the active compound, is what the pharmaceutical companies are now synthesizing as salicylic acid in Germany and France. The plant figured it out first. She looked at the water. "It's for fever and pain. It's one of the most useful things I can carry." He looked at her. "And you fell in the mud going to get it." "Third time in 3 years," she said. "Same mudbed. Different outcome." She looked at him. Considerably. He smiled. Fully. It was still the rarer thing on his face, which made it the more valuable, which she'd learned quickly and appreciated consistently. "I've been thinking about the Peterson parcel," he said. She'd heard about the Peterson parcel from Walsh, who'd mentioned it with the studied casualness of a man mentioning something he thought was important. "The one east of the valley. Creek access. Good grass, the right size for what I'm thinking." He turned toward the water. A humane operation. No whips, no breaking in the brutal sense. Working with what the horse is, not against it. He paused. "The roan's going to be the demonstration model. Walsh has agreed to let me sell him to a buyer of my choosing as a working horse, fully trained, to establish what's possible. When are you thinking?" "I've spoken to a land agent in Prescott. The parcel's available." He looked at the creek. "It would need work. The house is rough. The corrals need rebuilding." She waited. "I'm staying," he said, not as new information it had been understood for weeks, in the way things are understood between two people before they're said out loud, but said now, plainly and without qualification. "I'm staying here." In this valley, she looked at him. "I know," she said. "I've known since the flood. Before the flood, actually," he said. She thought about it. "The campfire at Walsh's ranch," she said. "The first night." He didn't confirm or deny. He just held the look with that steady, level quality she'd stopped trying to read through and had learned to receive as what it was, a man being present, fully, without reservation. "I want to show you something," he said. She followed him along the creek bank south, toward the canyon's entrance where the red sandstone walls began to rise, and the creek moved faster between them, the water catching the last of the late afternoon light in moving pieces. The bank widened here to a flat shelf of red stone where the cottonwoods had found a foothold, their leaves going yellow at the edges now, the first suggestion of the season changing. And the grass was blooming. Late-season desert wildflowers, the ones that came after the summer rains when the water was in the ground and the heat had backed off a fraction, small and persistent, yellow and white, and a pale, determined purple, growing in the cracks of the red stone and along the soft soil at the bank's edge. She stopped and looked at them. She'd walked this bank 100 times this summer, and the flowers hadn't been there, or hadn't been in bloom, or she'd been looking at other things. But they were here now, a scatter of them along the stone, the kind of small ordinary beauty that the desert produced when conditions were briefly right, and then withdrew before you'd had enough of it. Jesse stopped beside her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small object and held it in his palm, and she looked at it. A ring, silver plain-banded, and on the band a design worked into the metal, a small flower, the kind that bloomed along creek beds in this country, its petals laid down in careful lines by someone who'd known what they were making and why. She looked at it for a moment, then at him. He was down on one knee in the blooming desert grass. She hadn't seen him go down. She'd been looking at the ring, and there was something about that. About a man who could move quietly and deliberately in the same motion. That was very precisely him. Maeve Holloway, he said. I came into this valley 9 years into convincing myself that moving on was the same as living. He paused. You were in the mud. You were laughing. And something I'd kept locked up for a long time decided, without consulting me, that it was done waiting. She looked at him. At his face in the late light, the lines of it, the stillness that was not blankness, the directness that had always been there from the first moment he'd looked down at her from a horse and held a rope, and waited for her answer. I'm not moving on, he said. I'm asking you to be my partner. In this valley, in this life, in whatever the clinic needs and whatever the ranch needs, and whatever comes that neither of us can predict yet. He held the ring in his open palm. Be my partner for life. She looked at the ring, at the small creek flower worked into the silver, at the man kneeling in the wildflowers on the red stone bank of the creek where they'd found each other, and where the water ran clean again, and where the cottonwoods were going yellow at the edges, and the season was turning. She thought about her mother's voice, about a rented room at 15, and a decision about what to do with the space, about 3 years of a red door and a clinic and the work of treating every person who came through as a person worth treating, about a cavalry scout with a rope and a careful voice, and 9 years of moving that had ended here, in this canyon, in this valley, beside this creek. She took the ring from his palm. Yes, she said, simply and completely, the way she did everything that mattered to her. Yes. He stood. She put the ring on her own finger and looked at it, and then looked at him, and he looked back, and the afternoon light was long and red across the canyon, and the creek ran past them bright and purposeful, and the wildflowers were everything they were, small and real and briefly, perfectly here. She laughed. It came out the same as it had in the mud 6 weeks ago, clear and genuine, surprised by its own rightness, bouncing off the canyon walls the same way, coming back changed by the echo and still itself. Jesse smiled. The full version. No catching it this time, no holding it back. He put his hand against her jaw and kissed her, right there in the wildflowers and the late light, and she kissed him back the same way. She'd kissed him at the flood's edge directly, without performance, the real thing plainly done, and all the better for it. The canyon held the sound of them. The creek kept going. In the weeks that followed, the clinic opened its new door red again. Pierce had been specific about that, and the first patients came through it on a bright September morning, and Maeve stood in the reorganized dispensary, and Pierce stood at his desk, and the smell of carbolic acid and pine tar soap was back in the air, and everything that had been burned was replaced by something that worked as well, and in some cases worked better. The Peterson parcel transferred in October. Jesse started on the corrals first, building them right good posts, proper spacing, the round pen positioned for the morning light. Walsh sent Eli to help for 2 weeks, which was Walsh's way of saying what he thought of the enterprise, without saying it. The roan went to a rancher in Tucson who'd heard about the horse through Walsh's reputation and come to see him work. He watched the horse for an hour and bought him without negotiating, which was the best testimony available. Jesse watched the roan leave the yard and felt the particular pride of a completed thing, not loss, because the work was what mattered, and the work was done. Julian's crew stayed in the valley through the winter. 3 families bought small land parcels along the creek's lower course with the settlement money, the first property they'd ever owned, and broke ground for houses before the rains came. Julian himself took a supervisor's position at a smaller, legitimate mining operation north of Oakhaven. A man named Kellerman, who'd heard about the water situation and drawn his own conclusions about the kind of foreman he needed. Decker went to Texas. He sent a letter to Maeve from San Antonio 3 months later, 3 sentences, saying his hand had healed completely, and he'd found work at a medical supply company, which had not been the plan, but turned out to be the right place. She read it twice and tucked it in the dispensary drawer where she kept things worth keeping. Pierce recovered fully, to nobody's surprise, and according to his own timeline rather than Maeve's, which was the expected outcome of their negotiation. He was at full capacity by mid-October and began talking about expanding the clinic's services to the outlying homesteads, a monthly circuit through the valley, which would require a second medical person, and had Maeve's name attached to it in his mind before he'd finished the thought. She said yes before he finished asking. Briggs's criminal investigation into the clinic fire and the shooting of Pierce moved slowly, as Briggs had said it would, through the territorial legal system. Sterling, from a distance, through his attorney, cooperated minimally and strategically. The investigation was ongoing at the year's end, and Briggs sent a quarterly letter to Pierce updating him on its progress, which Pierce read carefully and filed, and did not allow to take up the space that the daily work required. "Is it enough?" Jesse asked him once, in November, sitting in the new clinic with coffee, and the first genuine cold of the season coming through the canyon, the investigation going slowly. Sterling somewhere else. Pierce thought about it for a moment. "The dam is gone," he said. "The water is back. The families are here, and their children are healthy." He looked at his desk, at the new case notes stacked in their organized rows. "The work continues. That's the measure I apply." Jessie looked at Maeve, who was at the dispensary door with her pencil behind her ear and a patient file in her hand. She looked back at him. The ring on her finger caught the lamplight briefly, the small creek flower turning gold for a moment, and then ordinary silver again. He thought about the 9 years of moving, about all the places he'd ridden through and left, about the particular specific quality of this canyon in this valley, the red walls and the creek sound, and the smell of sage in the heat, and the way the light fell long in the afternoons, about a woman laughing in the mud before she knew anyone was watching, choosing the room's use, finding the way through everything that came. He wasn't moving. Outside, the Sunstone Creek ran through the canyon, cold and full and clean, carrying the mountain's water down to the valley the way it always had, the way it would again, the way water returned to the course that was its own when the things blocking it were removed. The laughter was still there in the canyon's memory. The walls held it. On a still morning, Jessie thought, you could almost hear it, bright and clear, and bouncing back, transformed, the sound of a woman who'd decided what to do with joy, and done it, right there in the mud, before she even knew what was coming next. He was glad something in him had known enough to stop and listen.